Hello and welcome to day two of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Global Forum on Economic Recovery. I am Gary Lettman, Senior Vice President for Global Initiatives. We're delighted you have joined us. Yesterday, you heard from leaders of global companies, heads of state, and U.S. policymakers about the most relevant challenges we are facing together: pandemic response and recovery, digitalization of the economy, and inclusive growth. Today, we again welcome the audience of thousands of entrepreneurs from around the world who want to hear the U.S. Chamber Forum tackle energy transition, climate risks, environmental sustainability, trade, and our complex relations with China. Our Chief Executive Officer, Suzanne Clark, will also have a conversation with Bill Gates that you don't want to miss. Before we get going, I'd like to thank our generous and thoughtful sponsors, Google, Amazon, and UPS, for making this event possible. Now, I have the honor of introducing today's first speaker, who can address with depth and authority global economy and inclusion. Dr. Antoinette Sayeh is the Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund and the former Senior World Bank Executive and Finance Minister of Liberia. Just to mention some of the recent successes of her distinguished career, Dr. Sayeh led a substantial increase in IMF support for sub-Saharan Africa and major expansion of assistance provided by the International Development Association, the World Bank's window for the poorest. We're delighted to have her join us today. Welcome, Dr. Sayeh.
Thank you for the kind introduction. A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Let me first warmly congratulate Suzanne Clark for being the first woman to lead the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. From one institution led by a woman to another, we couldn't be happier. We look forward to working with her and building on the decades-long partnership between our two institutions. We are more than a year into the biggest, most urgent crisis of our lifetimes. And as countries look ahead to recovery, they will be focused on two priorities: growth and jobs. Which is why I am particularly excited to speak at this event, because you, the private sector, are the biggest engines of growth and jobs. The role of the IMF is focused on helping countries create sound macroeconomic frameworks which are necessary for markets to function effectively, for the private sector to operate efficiently, and therefore to spur growth and create jobs. So thank you for inviting me. This last year has also reminded us that fighting a global pandemic, dealing with climate change, reducing inequality, these big consequential issues transcend national borders and all relate to the sustainability of growth. They can only be tackled by countries working together. So I will speak to you today about three such areas where we need multilateral solutions. But first, let me begin with where the global economy stands. After a contraction of 3.3% in 2020, which was the worst recession since the Second World War, the global economy is now on a path to recovery. Last month, we lifted our global forecast to 6% in 2021 and 4.4% in 2022. We got to this point because of the unprecedented policy response from countries, which included $16 trillion in fiscal action and massive liquidity injection by central banks. Without these synchronized measures by countries, the global contraction last year would have been at least 3 times worse. Of course, there is high uncertainty in this forecast. Here, I think of the emergence of new virus strains, the uneven path of the pandemic, and countries' abilities to sustain policy support. The heartbreaking situation we see in India reminds us that the crisis is far from being over. What is clear, though, is the dangerous prospect of divergence across countries. The global recovery is powered by only a few countries with advanced vaccination efforts and successful containment, leaving poorer countries at greater risk of falling behind. The implications of this divergence are dire. Over half of the developing countries that were once catching up to advanced economy income levels are now set to fall further behind. Emerging markets face the risk of tighter financial conditions and capital outflows. Many developing countries carry higher debt burdens. Some of the poorest already face a high risk of debt distress. The sad reality is that much of the past hard-won development gains will be wiped out. This economic divergence can only weigh down long-term growth in advanced economies, causing increased economic migration and undermine social stability around the world. The growing effects of climate change will likely make the repercussions even worse. Closing this gap is therefore not just the right thing to do. It is key to ensuring a sustainable, long-term recovery for all countries. So let me lay out the 3 economic priorities for multilateral action that the Fund views as essential for a strong, sustained, inclusive, and green recovery. First, vaccines. Right now, vaccine policy is the most important economic policy. Investing in ensuring everyone rapidly has access to vaccines may well be the highest return public project if you consider that faster progress in ending this crisis would add almost $9 trillion to global GDP by 2025, enabling over $1 trillion in additional tax revenue. Coordinated international action on vaccines is key in this respect. But this window is closing fast. The longer it takes to speed up vaccine rollout, the harder it will be to achieve these gains. We must do whatever it takes to ramp up production capacity and deploy a fair mechanism to redistribute vaccines from surplus to deficit countries. This also requires a fully funded COVAX facility to accelerate vaccination in poorer countries. Second priority, international tax. Let me say this, it is broadly in the interest of countries and of the private sector to limit tax competition and the proliferation of chaotic, unilateral tax measures. We must come together to create an international tax system that is designed for the 21st century, one that is simplified, harmonized, predictable, and fair, thus instilling broad public trust. Multilateral efforts are already underway with the inclusive framework initiated by the OECD, which now includes 139 countries. This type of a coordinated approach will help simplify an overly complex system, better align incentives, and provide predictability. It will also help create a fair system where companies pay taxes in the countries where they operate. The IMF supports the inclusive framework, and we are optimistic about a global agreement this year. Our third priority, climate. Yes, it is an economic priority. Climate change has an impact on macroeconomic and financial stability and presents risk to the functioning of our economies. At the same time, the way in which we respond to this challenge also offers opportunities for growth and jobs. So, as the world starts to recover, we must accelerate the shift to a green economy. To do that, we need a robust price on carbon, which can send a critical market signal and advance climate-friendly investments. IMF analysis shows that steadily rising carbon prices and a green investment push could boost global GDP by about 0.7% per year in the next 15 years and create millions of new jobs. Carbon pricing is already gaining momentum. Many businesses now use a shadow carbon price in their models. But the average global price of $2 a ton needs to rise substantially by 2030 to be in line with the Paris Agreement. This is why the IMF has called for an international carbon price floor among large emitters, such as the G20. Focus on a minimum carbon price among a small group of large emitters could facilitate an agreement covering up to 80% of global emissions. Of course, such a price floor has to be pragmatic and in line with countries' economic development. And it can be implemented through carbon taxes, trading systems, or other equivalent measures that match local policy preferences. Crucially, such a price floor could avoid the less efficient border adjustments if some countries move ahead with robust pricing while others do not. In parallel, we also need to unlock the potential of private finance and align the global financial system with climate objectives. The good news is that the financial industry is beginning to step up. Investors, however, also cite the poor quality of availability of data as the biggest barrier to sustainable investing. That is why the IMF is working with countries and partners on data quality and disclosure, as well as on financial sector stress testing for climate-related issues. We need a green taxonomy and standardized reporting of climate-related financial risk to bring more certainty to investment decisions, improve understanding of transition risk, and help unlock trillions of dollars in private finance. Focusing on a green recovery clearly opens up prospects. But the harsh reality is that poorer nations risk missing out on this historic transformation. IMF research shows that low-income countries need $450 billion over 5 years to fight the pandemic, preserve buffers, and return to the path of catching up to higher income levels. They can cover only a portion of this on their own. The good news is that the world did come together last year in an unprecedented way through the IMF. Since the start of the pandemic, the IMF has provided over $110 billion in financing to 86 countries. Just to put that in perspective, never in our history have we done so much so fast. We also provided debt service relief to 29 of our poorest member countries, which is in addition to the G20's debt service suspension initiative. All this has given countries breathing room, allowing them to focus on protecting lives and livelihoods. The G20 Common Framework is also an important initiative to address vulnerabilities, debt vulnerabilities, and create policy space in low-income countries. And here, private financial sector institutions have a key role to play in debt restructurings, not only from the point of view of fairer burden sharing, but also to help avoid protracted debt crises, which are detrimental to growth. And just last month, the IMF received a mandate from our Board of Governors to pursue a general SDR allocation worth $650 billion. If formalized in the coming months, we will be able to inject $650 billion of SDRs into countries' reserves. This new SDR allocation will boost confidence in the global recovery, just as it did at the time of the last allocation in 2009 during the global financial crisis. So much more needs to be done, of course. But from what we have seen so far, we are optimistic. Actions taken by 190 countries through the IMF speak to a renewed support for global solutions to global challenges. Before I close, I'd like to call on you for your support. The private sector has a big role in addressing the challenges before us. As I noted in the beginning, you will continue to be the engines of growth and job creation, helping the world not just to boost living standards, but also to leapfrog to a more sustainable future. So, join us to build the foundation of a better 21st century economy and make the period ahead the most consequential one of our lifetimes. Thank you.
We're very pleased to be joined today by three very thoughtful, strategic thinkers for a conversation on China. We have Charlene Barshevsky, Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, who during her time in government was one of the major architects of the negotiated agreement that led China into the WTO. Steve Hadley is a former national security advisor under President George W. Bush. And Q-Song Lee is the CEO of the Carlyle Group, who will moderate this today's discussion. It promises to be very interesting and provocative, and we look forward to the views that are expressed right now. Q-Song Lee.
Charles, thank you. And let me join you in the chamber in welcoming Steve and Charlene to this hopefully very engaging and I'm sure a very insightful discussion. And let's just get right into it. With all that's going on in the world, Charlene, just help us just take a step back. Where are we with US-China relations from your perspective, and maybe high level, where do you think this is going?
So first of all, thank you so much. Great to be with you, of course, and with Steve, and thank you to the chamber as well. Let me, if I could, make just a couple of general points and then talk a little bit about the economic relationship. Two general points. The first is that China's ascendancy presents a long-term, multidimensional challenge to the US and indeed to many countries in the world. And China's ascendancy is marked by an increasingly contested global order across all dimensions, whether political, economic, technological, space, security, military, so on and so forth. Other countries present threats. There is no other country that is a challenge across all of these domains. And I believe China looks particularly at the United States and sees exactly the same thing, but in the reverse. So China, of course, has been described as a strategic rival, a competitive threat, an enemy, lots of different words. I think it's very difficult to pin one word on the nature of the relationship. I just think that China presents myriad challenges to the United States, to Western democracies and generally, and economically to many countries in the world. Second general point I'd make is that China's governing model is highly statist. The state is at the center. On the economic side, that means state-led development, per a strategic plan developed by the state over many, many, many years. And on the political side, you're looking at party-centric political and social control. And I point this out because it has long been said in the West that only democracies, only free countries can drive sustainable growth, only free countries can innovate. And China's view is that its particular model brings both sustainable economic growth and innovation, coupled with political and social order. And that this stands in sharp contrast with the West and is a more desirable model than the Western model. So you have conflicts across all domains, and then you have a conflict in economic models between the two nations. And on the economic side, that conflict is crystallized, and it's crystallized by China's intensive focus on what it calls the technologies of the future economy, the fourth industrial revolution. China is determined to lead in that, having missed the industrial revolution of the 17 and 1800s. And it is in this area of technologies, IP, heavy industries, value-added manufacturing, the future economy, part of which is here today, that is at the heart of the US-China relationship. In terms of where things are going, thinking about Xi Jinping as being in power, of course, we can't say that's forever, but Xi Jinping believes that China's model, that its focus on innovation, that its programmatic desire to dominate in industries of the future is the direction of the world. As he says, history is on China's side, the momentum is on China's side. And for the United States, the key and most important factor in the nature of the relationship with China is a strong United States, economically strong, militarily strong. Nothing compensates for that, nothing substitutes for it in this relationship with China.
Okay, Charlene, you set up so many great issues for us. So let me push with one quick follow-up question, then I want to get Steve into the discussion. The way it's been set up, with China's intent on making sure it leads in the digital revolution, with the rivalry that you've described across so many different dimensions, the competition, and quite, obviously the very different form of governance and governing model. Everything in that suggests that there is a zero-sum mentality that is potentially inevitable. And so I guess my question is there a potential for coexistence at all? Or do you think we're slated for continuous confrontation with this zero-sum mindset?
So zero-sum mindsets are highly destructive because the zero-sum applies in both directions. Mm-hmm. Neither country is so dominant in particular areas that it can believe it is in a position to dominate at this juncture. That creates its own restraint on both countries. See, both countries need time. China needs time to further strengthen itself. It needs time toward its goal of self-sufficiency. The US needs time to strengthen its economy, to strengthen its social fabric. That exercises a kind of restraint in the way zero-sum thinking might. But in terms of the long run, I think the jury is out. One always hopes for peace, for coexistence. There should be, as Xi Jinping has said, every reason for the countries to coexist, no reason for the countries to go to war. But things are rarely so black and white. And so for the longer term, I do worry.
Steve, our former president tried to do much to change the nature of the relationship and in many ways, policies to hold China back. What's Biden's current policy and what's your read of it in the early days of the administration? What's really changed? And what do you think the path forward is with respect to the current president and what we're going to do vis-a-vis China?
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank the Chamber for having this event and giving me a chance to participate with you and with Charlene. I think that there is a belief I think, generally in the United States and within the Biden administration, that China has decided that, as they say, the correlation of forces favors China, that Western values are on the decline, and the United States in particular is in decline. They see that in how we've managed COVID, in terms of some of our financial problems. And this is really China's moment. And I think many in the administration think we need to change that perception on the part of the Chinese if we are going to be able to have the kind of constructive relationship and get China to change some of the behavior that Charlene has talked about. How do you do that? Well, I think they have sort of three things they want to do. One, they want to craft a bipartisan approach to China, because I think that will send the signal to the Chinese of staying power, that this is something they're going to have to deal with over the long term. And I think they have a good chance of constructing a bipartisan China strategy. Secondly, they want to get our friends and allies bought into that strategy and policy. Alone, we do not have enough weight to change China's behavior, but with our friends and allies, we have an economic and geopolitical weight that might achieve that. And thirdly, there are things we need to do at home to put ourselves in a position to compete effectively: infrastructure, high technology investments, so that China has to understand that if they really want a head-to-head competition, they may lose. Having sort of established that platform of strength, and hopefully can disabuse China of the notion of American decline, they then, I think, are crafting a policy that's sort of a three-track policy. And you heard it in what Secretary Blinken has said. We are going to compete where we should. We are going to cooperate where we can. And we're going to stand up for our principles where, in fact, we must do so in the face of differences that matter with Chinese, particularly over values and the like. And their hope is to pursue those three, in some sense, in parallel. They believe they have to correct for the underplaying of human rights concerns on the part of President Trump. So I think they've kind of overdone a little bit the human rights issue to make the point that human rights are back on our agenda. I think they will find a way to talk to China about human rights in a way that does not derail the rest of the agenda. Secondly, in the area of competition, the trick is going to be to separate our economies in the high-tech areas where we need to, and where China has said that it wants to in order to be greater self-sufficient, but not let that decoupling go across the board. So there still is cross-investment and trade where it makes sense for the two countries. And then finally, areas of cooperation. They've talked about they want to do it. Everybody knows the list: pandemics, climate change, macroeconomic issues, Iran, the like. The real challenge there is to stop talking about cooperation and start doing cooperation, with concrete cooperation on things that are important, that send the message to both of our peoples that there's actually something in it for both peoples if the two countries can cooperate. I think that's what they're going to try to do. Pursue those three tracks at the same time and not let any one track take the other two hostage. The query is whether the Chinese are willing to play within that construct, and can we avoid confrontation over things like Taiwan that might throw the whole thing into a cocktail.
So that's what I was just about to ask you, which is, okay, so you've laid out incredibly well our approach, three-pronged approach. Take us to the other side of the equation, looking at it through President Xi and what's happening in China. What is their perspective on their approach vis-a-vis what you just outlined? Answer your query. Answer the query that you set up.
I think actually the three-prong approach is more explicit now than it has been before. But in fact, under the Clinton administration, or the Bush administration, or the Obama administration, we were always working these three approaches.
Mhm.
What's different now? One, on human rights, the Chinese tolerance for being lectured by us on human rights is at an all-time low. And I think what we need to do there is agree that we're going to agree to disagree, to make it clear that neither of us is trying to change the regime of the other. We accept that we can cooperate and we can coexist. But while the Chinese keep talking about American interference in Chinese matter, I tell you, one of the things under the Xi regime is they've been interfering in our political system plenty. And if we're going to go back to that coexistence, they're going to have to knock it off. They're going to have to knock it off. Again, on the competition, much more intense now than it ever has been before. The trick is, can we compete and separate where we feel we must, but bound that competition so that it is a competition where on a level playing field, they're going to win some, we're going to win some, not a form of competition where you try to put the other side out of business. Can we bound the competition? I think that's the question. And in cooperation, I would just say again, lots of areas of cooperation. I think both sides recognize it. Getting China and the United States to cooperate is really hard. And I think one of the things we have to do is do what we can at the government to government level, but get the governments out of the way and empower the kind of bottom-up cooperation between our businesses, between our universities, between our scientists, that probably is where we will be most effective in the cooperation between the two countries.
More points of constructive engagement. Charlene, you touched on this, but let me ask, implicit in what both of you have said as you've laid this out is kind of the current Xi doctrine and Xi approach. Is Xi and the current approach forever?
So this is a really interesting question. We know, if we look at Europe or the United States, we know that leadership matters. Leadership can be constructive. Leadership can be destructive. One doesn't have to be an autarchical government to see that democracies are affected by leadership as well. And so the question is Xi's brand of leadership something permanent? Has it now been so inculcated into the party that the next leader is bound to continue Xi's policies? Or is there more flexibility there? Is there more fragility there with respect to Xi Jinping's rule, such that at some point, as he steps down, there are changes in China? The one thing I think that Xi has done particularly effectively, though, which I think does put some bounds on a successor, is encapsulating its military and strategic and economic posture in a wrapper. And that wrapper is the China dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. And the way Xi has defined that to encompass, as he says, all forms of China's power. This is further reduced to comprehensive national power, comprehensive national power. And this is an extremely attractive wrapper on the whole of all of these disparate programs. And because there is a kind of determinism about the outcome, China had always been at the center for thousands of years, Its retreat from the center is relatively new, 500-600 years. So this notion that there is a right, it is China's destiny to again be at the center, to be able to fulfill the dream of rejuvenation, and the pieces to do that, which on their face sound completely sensible and rational, right? Strong military, strong economy, accelerated development, technological dominance, all of these things sound completely sensible. and many would argue are completely sensible. These elements are perhaps what's at play around the edges, but the wrapper of the dream, I think, is very powerful. And I think a leader would depart from it to his peril, because it would look as though a new leader were weak. The dream is no longer the dream.
Interesting. You know, I'm curious. Many years ago, the Beijing Olympics represented something quite important for China, and their whole behavior internationally was influenced by the staging of that event. And, you know, Steve, let me go back to something you said, which is things may be different this time. Let's talk about the upcoming Winter Olympics and just what's different this time. And do you think there's going to be as much sensitivity from China with respect to the rest of the world in terms of relations as this event approaches?
In 2008, the last Olympics, the Chinese really, it was China's coming out party. And they didn't want anybody raining on their parade. And they were clearly on their best behavior in the run up to the Olympics. China today is a different China, much more self-confident China. They want things to go well for the upcoming Olympics. But I think their attitude is that they have a lot more leeway in the run up to the Olympics, because China is a different China, and most countries will come and play on China's terms. I think what you're going to see is countries will show up. I don't think there'll be a great boycott, but they may show up at a level or two below the top political level to send a message. And I think businesses are going to be a little bit more cautious in their affiliation with the Olympics. But I think generally it's going to be different this time. And I don't think it'll be a constraint, particularly on Chinese behavior. I want to, if I can, just add to what your conversation with Charlene. It's one thing to say the next leader after Xi Jinping. I think we need to look more broadly than that. Charlene is right. Xi is mobilizing Chinese society with the China dream, and he's keeping control of China's society by saying the United States is trying to oppose our ability to reach the China dream. Therefore, we have to have solidarity at home. But what happens in 2051? When they are a fully developed country and they've reached the China dream, what will be the mindset of that generation? And will it really be comfortable and willing to accept the degree of repression and control that Xi Jinping is exercising now in the name of overcoming resistance to achieving the China dream? I don't think we know. A lot of people say, well, we were too naive. We thought economic reform and opening would lead to political opening. I don't think we drank that Kool-Aid. I thought we had a lot of other good reasons for the China policy we pursued, but I wouldn't count that out yet, that over time, the kind of openness on the economic side won't lead to demands on the political side. I was with a track two with Chinese this morning. They said, you don't recognize how much China has evolved over in 40 years. And my answer was, I recognize that, but you need to recognize that China will continue to evolve. And we don't know what it's going to look like 40 years from now.
So with that comment, how do you interpret, Steve, the more recent actions on the tech sector and the tech companies, which have been kind of, among the most amazing things that have happened in Chinese business, and their regulation and some of the strong signals they're sending to those leadership teams within these businesses?
Well, this is Charlene's expertise, so I'm going to defer to her, but I'll just say two things. One, there's a good news and bad news. The interesting news is that China is actually acting out on the tech sector, dealing with some of the concerns that the US Congress and the American people may have about our tech sector. China's just getting ahead of us. That's the good news. The bad news is this is a message from Xi Jinping, a la Vladimir Putin and his attitude in the early 21st century with respect to oligopolists and the oil industry. He's basically saying political control trumps everything. And he, I think, believes that these institutions got too big for their britches, got too much economic power. That would translate into political power. And Xi Jinping is not going to brook any competitors for political power. That's the bad news of the crackdown.
Right. A statement about who's really the boss here. Charlene,
Exactly.
this is your area of anything you want to add to what Steve just said?
No, I couldn't have said it better than Steve. The key learning, I think, is that there are no alternative sources of power other than the party. Period, full stop. Even if you are successful, even if you are a world-class company from a country that has trouble building world-class brands, even if you are embedded, you are the emblem of what Xi is trying to achieve across the board with respect to technologies of the future. There are no alternative sources of power, or power centers, I should say, other than the party.
Right.
Period.
All right, let's shift gears now, Charlene. I want to stick with you. In part of your comments, but also Steve elaborated on it, there was an important element of cooperate where we can, and even get our allies to help in this effort as it relates to the evolving relationship that we're still trying to figure out, obviously, between China and the United States. But let me broaden it to the Western world. And so how important is Europe in the evolving nature of this relationship, and what role will they play, and can we really count on them?
So this is a $64,000 question. Certainly, the United States ought to have a plan B on the assumption that working with friends and allies is not easy, that you can be close friends but have significant differences with respect to certain interests that you hold. You're under different pressures, under different politics. Every country has its politics. And so the United States may find, even with the best of intention on the part of all parties, that cooperation falls short of achieving particular goals. I think if you look at Europe, there are sort of 5 reasons they might think of China differently from the United States, or might be less capable of joining the United States effort. I think the first, of course, for Europe is the degree of export dependency on China. Germany is the poster child of that. Second, the disagreements within the EU itself, Northern Europe from Southern Europe, and the relationship of Southern European countries to China, including with respect to Chinese inward investment versus some of the Northern countries. I think third, threat perceptions differ. Europe does not feel at security risk from China. Europe is not positioned in the Pacific the way the United States is. And the result is that Europe does not feel a sense of imminent threat as the United States might feel. Indeed, many Europeans believe even indirectly there is no threat from China. I think fourth, you have Macron and strategic autonomy. Europe wants to embrace strategic autonomy. How could it follow the United States? And last, and perhaps this is a good lesson for the United States to think about, the US may want to retain its status as the sole superpower, or as a superpower, or as unique in the world. Europe is not going to fight with China in order to preserve America's unique role in the world. That's a US interest. It is not an interest Europe would necessarily fight China over. On the other hand, Europe has made clear it is very disturbed by China's behavior on human rights related issues and on values, fundamental values. Of course, that comports with the US view. Public opinion in Europe is as negative on China as it is in the United States. Third, Europe is affected by Chinese mercantilism and these highly distortive trade and economic policies coming out of China. And last, Europe recognizes, as does the US, that unilateral approaches don't work very well. They don't really move China at any fundamental level. And so I think as we look at the European picture, and you think about the constraints they're under, but you think about sort of these general interests that we hold in common, Europe will end up doing a balancing act. And that's in part why the US needs a plan B, because balance implies you don't get everything you want.
Right. So obviously there's an undercurrent of trying to thread the needle there that Europe has, which leads me to the next question, which Steve, I'd like to put to you, but I'm sure the audience members, but also all of us could appreciate your counsel on this. Increasingly in this politicized environment, it feels like US companies and European companies, all companies are being asked to perhaps make a choice. And in the context of issues like Taiwan and human rights, et cetera, what is the best way for companies to try to navigate this, as increasingly it feels like in many instances, people are asked to make a choice? Is it about your values and your country and what you stand for, or about business and making money and commercial efforts? And it's getting very difficult. So any thoughts you have on this very touchy and tricky issue would be, I'm sure, most appreciated.
I've got some thoughts. I know Charlene as well. Let me just make one comment on the allies point. I agree with everything Charlene said. You know, Americans talk about how we're unique because we have this great global set of alliances that China does not have. And that is a comparative advantage for us. But watch out what China is doing in the developing world. They are building a constituency for themselves in terms of the Belt Road Initiative, in terms of COVID vaccinations and the like. And when they talk about supporting the UN system, what they have in mind is if the United States can stymie them in the Security Council, they will go to the General Assembly and collect chits on all those developing country votes. That's what they mean by their version of the international system is the UN system. We need to be paying attention to that. Look, companies are, you know, between a rock and a hard place, as we say, in terms of doing business in China. China wants to force them to choose, as does the United States. And there's sort of four ways this gets played out. One, these kind of ideological issues. Do you condemn what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang, or are you willing to accept what China's doing in Xinjiang and even accept product out of Xinjiang? Do you support the national security law in Hong Kong, or do you oppose it? These are lose-lose propositions for US companies. And they should not be making statements either in pacts or unilaterally. These are issues where they have to keep their head down, because they will either alienate China or they will alienate the administration, the Congress, and the American people, and their CEOs will be drug up before the Congress to explain why they signed on to the Hong Kong national security law. So on these political things, there's nothing in it for US companies to take a position. Second, there are operational challenges. You see that with Apple's story. I don't know whether it's true or not. Apple supposedly has taken all its data on Chinese citizens, put it in China, put it in a facility that is run by the Chinese government and to which they will have access. This is anathema to what the United States government thinks companies should be doing. So there are enormous operational choices that companies are being asked to make in how they conduct operations in China. And they've got to try to find a way to thread the needle to see if they can be compliant with both Chinese law and American law and sensitivities. Third, they may not be able to thread the needle. And one of the things I think US companies need to do is to monitor the situation of the business environment and political environment in China, have really indicators that will tell them whether things are getting better and getting worse. And they need to have contingency plans that if things really get bad, they can move their people out, they can move their operations out and diversify in the region out of China. They've got to be in a position to do that because the uncertainties are so high. That's my take. Charlene will have her own.
Charlene?
I think Steve and I are in alignment about this. I think one of the most challenging areas for companies, though, are their own employees and employee expectations as to what the company stands for. This is an acute issue with respect to millennials as well as younger people, many of whom are in companies today. And so this issue of how employees feel, how your shareholders feel, how your institutional shareholders feel about issues, what they expect of a company beyond simply making money. This is, I think, the up and coming issue. ESG issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, issues that pertain to human rights in that regard. I think these will become increasingly inescapable for companies. Certainly programmatically, you already see that today on the part of many companies, but also with respect to a company's view as to its responsibilities in a broader world. And so as Steve, I think the single most important thing here is an evaluation of risk. It is to have in place in advance mitigation measures. It is to have extremely sophisticated communication strategies, including social media strategies. And it is to be able to pivot rapidly such that diversification without undue disruption is possible, even if there's a bit of redundancy that has to be built in, even if it means some increases in costs. There is nothing more harmful to a company than reputational risk or reputational downturn. As you know, it's very hard to regain trust once you've lost it. And so companies have to be prepared in advance in a way that would have been even unthinkable 5 years ago. It's a different world now and will continue to be so.
All right, so we've got, I mean, we've gone all, so many interesting issues we've explored. We've got time for one more question, and I'll start with Charlene, and then Steve, also the same question to you. So taking a step back, as I've listened carefully, it feels like China's not really going to be deterred, at least with its present regime in place, with respect to its aspirations. Feels like there's going to be continued points of rivalry, competition, while all at the same time, we're looking for ways to constructively engage, to figure out where we can cooperate. And it feels like we have two very different systems with different values, with different forms of leadership and government. And the question is really, is there coexistence even possible with the rivalry that has developed or not? And you've given us some thoughts on that. And Charlene, I'm curious, if we try to end this on an optimistic note, if there was one thing the United States really needed to do, what would that one thing be?
Self-strengthen.
Focus inward, strengthen domestically.
There is, as I said earlier, there is nothing that will compensate for a weak United States. A weak United States and a response that brings in our allies won't get the result you want, because the allies will have no confidence that the United States has their back. A weak United States is a vulnerable looking United States. A weak United States is a United States that can't adequately protect or project US interests abroad. If we look at the behavior of China during the US financial meltdown, we can see that the vacuum created by US leadership because of US weakness, in that case, economic weakness and vulnerability, really gave room, gave space for China and other regimes to come to the fore in a way that was rapid and difficult to address, as we now see. So I think for my money, a strong United States is everything. It has, in some ways, less to do with China,
Right.
and more to do with our own internal fabric, our own internal security, our own view of our place in the world. None of that is accomplished by a weak country, or certainly not rationally accomplished by a weak country. So my goal is always the US first, in the sense of get your own house in order. That's
Sure.
job 1, 2, and 3. And China will do what it will do. The US is best positioned to respond to whatever China does if it is also strong.
Steve, I started with Charlene, so you get the last word. I'm going to put the same question to you. You're on mute, Steve.
Sorry, there was some background noise here. I agree with Charlene. It starts with the United States fixing itself. If it does so, we have lots of strength in terms of our economy, university system of innovation, a strong younger generation coming forward. It will convince China that maybe the correlation of forces doesn't inevitably favor China, that they're going to have to deal with a US competitor over the long term. And I think both countries will decide that they need to find a way to coexist, because each government has made pledges to its people. China wants to realize the China dream, wants to become a mature, developed country. President Biden has talked about wanting to address the grievances of the middle class. If China and the United States have a across-the-board confrontation, neither regime is going to meet its pledges for its people. So on balance, at the end of the day, if we take care of our knitting, strengthen ourselves, I think we can find a way to an outcome that is peaceful and prosperous and can actually benefit both countries. But there's a lot of lifting that needs to be done to get there.
A lot of lifting and over a very long term. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky and Stephen Hadley for all of your insights and the willingness to engage in this discussion. And on behalf of the Chamber and everyone who's listening, thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the program.
I want to welcome our global audience today for an informative and really interesting session with Prime Minister Lee of Singapore. I want to thank you, Prime Minister Lee, for participating in today's U.S. Chamber Forum on the Global Economic Recovery. And I want to thank Mr. Prime Minister, your ambassador to Washington. Ambassador Mimpuri has not only been a terrific ambassador, but he really did help set up this interview today. The Prime Minister assumed his duties in 2004, but I want to say that he's really one of the great international statesmen and someone who has a great perspective on many of the pressing challenges we face today in the global community. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Prime Minister Lee, and I know we look forward to all your comments on areas where we have shared concerns and shared challenges and perhaps shared opportunities. The world has changed quite a bit, Prime Minister, since you and I got together in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Chamber in 2017. And boy, do I wish we had conditions which would allow you to come visit again soon, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and be in Washington. But we're going to take full advantage of this virtual forum to conduct an interview today. Let me just say to our global audience that Singapore very much plays a pivotal role in the global economy. Certainly, $300 billion of direct investment from the United States is just one measurement of the important economic weight of Singapore. But Singapore has commercial and obviously important destinations for ports in terms of trade links to China, to India, to the rest of Southeast Asia, and of course, to the United States. Prime Minister Lee, you and your government have not only capably managed the COVID crisis in your country, but you have played an important role over time in promoting open trade and investment. And I want to thank you for being with us again today for this important forum. Let's start with a question around COVID. I think it's very clear that you and your government have capably managed the COVID situation, but containing the virus is an ongoing challenge. We'll look at India and the potential for contagion, the concerns we all have about the spread of the virus and the spread of variants. Tell us a little bit about your experience, how you've managed it, and what you see is the role of the international community to combat this virus in countries all over the world that are suffering and struggling to really manage through this period. Prime Minister?
Well, we've had an unforgettable 1+ year now. We've had some difficult times. We had quite a big outbreak of COVID-19 in our migrant worker dormitories. But in the general population, with a great effort, we kept cases low. Our fatalities have been very low. So far, we've had 32 fatalities in total for the whole country. And we are in a stable position, but far from out of the woods, because right now we have a fresh super spreading cluster, and we have just tightened up our restrictions and gathering rules again. So the conclusion I come to from this is, firstly, that you can not afford to slacken. Each time you think you've got it under control and you know how to respond to it, it pops up in a new direction. It can be a mutant, it can be a new avenue which you didn't spot, but you cannot afford to slacken, and you must always think beyond what you imagine is likely to happen. Secondly, for us, prior experience has helped. We were lucky or unlucky to have had SARS in 2003, and that primed our system to gear up for a next new disease, and primed our population to understand what was at stake and what kind of collective responses we needed. And so it made it easier for us this time round to have the right policies and to have the population cooperate with us and make the policies work. And it's like that with South Korea, with Hong Kong, with quite a number of the other Asian countries too. Thirdly, it has reminded us of the importance of international cooperation. By and large, that has held up. There has been scramble for PPE at the beginning. There's scramble for vaccines now, doses. But internationally, the supply chains have not broken down. You can still buy iPhones made in any number of countries. You can still buy cars, which parts come from many continents. And we have not taken giant strides towards autarky. Protectionism, yes. Autarky, no. So that is a qualified plus. We are a small, open country. We have to deal with it as things go along, and we can't afford to seal our borders off. Other countries bigger can, to a very great extent. For Singapore, you need food, you need fuel, you need people moving in and out, even during COVID. And you have to do it to the extent that you can while keeping ourselves safe with all the precautions, testing, contact tracing, apps, protocols to make sure that people come in through proper procedures and are vetted and so on. Not without risk, but unavoidable. To open up completely and to open up again and have free travel, I think is a long way off. Even travel bubbles, countries talk about it, but that needs confidence on both sides. And we only want to bubble with countries which are safer than us. And that means it's not easy to make a match, but I hope that as societies get vaccinated and as confidence returns and the disease gets brought under control, that will be possible. India worries us a lot, but it's not just India where it's who are in a very difficult spot now. But Latin America has had a very difficult time, and other parts of the world, Africa, for example, where cases are still low, at least the reported cases, but it's not. The vaccinated population is very low also. And we are very anxious that what has happened to the rest of the world will not befall Africa too, which would have consequences not just on that continent.
Prime Minister, you briefly touched on this in your opening thoughts and reflections, but I want you to just tell the international community, what is really your approach going to be to reopening travel? We know how important travel and tourism is going to be to recovering our economies worldwide. So what is your approach? And you mentioned travel bubbles, but are you part of an international consortium to try to encourage more travel going forward to reopen as quickly? Can you give us a little bit of clarity about your approach here?
There's no international consortium yet because I think the countries are not yet ready to do so. In fact, some of them are still tightening up their rules because of the recent outbreak of more transmissible mutants. But in our case, what we are trying to do is to establish travel bubbles with other countries where we have mutual understanding of each other's situations and mutual confidence that we will be open with one another and will keep things under control, or if not, we'll fly a red flag straight away. We have a travel bubble agreed with Hong Kong, but it has not been implemented yet. And as things are, it may be a while before it comes into effect. We have various ways of having safe travel between us and other countries, limited numbers, but at least it keeps the channels open. Beyond that, we would like to have a wider ink blot and join all these travel bubbles together, but I think it'll take a while.
Prime Minister, let's talk about trade. As a country, Singapore is obviously very trade dependent. And I know you worry about bottlenecks and vulnerabilities in supply chains. A number of countries in Southeast Asia are looking to really reshore or to nearshore supply chains, perhaps from China. There's a lot of policy ramifications to that. You know, a lot of major economies around the world, the United States and Europe, and other countries are contemplating changes in policy around supply chains, partly in response to the COVID crisis and national security considerations. What do you propose we do as a global community to ensure that trade flows are kept open and that we fortify against supply chain disruptions?
I think that it would be very, very harmful if every country tried to make everything onshore. And anyway, it's impossible. You can have the final assembly of your devices in your own country, but to make everything, all the components yourself is a stretch. And to get all the raw materials yourself, I think is in most cases going to be impossible. So we have to cooperate with one another. I think there will be greater desire to have more resilience and less just in time, more just in case. But if that goes too far, the price is going to be very high. And you can't even make vaccines all by yourself. You do need not just the raw materials, but also the bottle stoppers, all sorts of things which come from all around the world. So to solve these problems, one by one is impossible. Bilaterally, which I think the previous administration tried to do, one-on-one, is very hard. And you do have to work multilaterally with more partners in order that we come together and we establish rules which apply to all of us, and we can cooperate together and establish trust amongst all of us. And I'm very happy that this administration in the US is re-engaging with the WTO. It has weaknesses, but we should work together to remedy and strengthen the WTO, not to marginalize and cast it aside. I think that's at the top level, but there will be many other areas of cooperation regionally. Singapore, we ourselves, we've joined in the CPTPP. We are participating in the RCEP, which is an Asian trading group. And we would like to pursue this further, not just traditional trade, but also new areas. For example, digital economy partnership agreements or green economy partnership agreements, which may be perhaps politically more acceptable and more doable in America. Ideally, we would like America to be part of this and to be negotiating trade arrangements with other countries. I think realistically that you're busy now, and the political climate in Congress and in the country probably wouldn't push for this, to put it very mildly. But I hope that the mood will change and you will find your way forward to have a positive trade agenda before too long, and possibly one day find a way to work your way back into the CPTPP. After all, America was a major architect of that. And the House is basically what America had a part in designing and crafted, even now.
Well, Prime Minister, we could not agree with you more at the U.S. Chamber. I mean, after all, 95% of the customers we want to sell to live outside the United States. So clearly, we want to see a strong WTO system. There's a need for reform, as you suggested. And we also agree with your idea around a digital arrangement. And we'll be talking to our government about that, be assured. Let me talk about U.S.-China relations next, because you have a critical relationship with both the United States and China. You've watched the trajectory of this relationship over many years. You've seen the increasing tensions in the relationship over trade, human rights issues, over technology, the regulation and national security aspects of technology, over South China Seas, and over many other areas. We all know that having a stable, constructive, and pragmatic relationship between China and the United States is critical, not just for the bilateral relationship, but for the world economy, and certainly from your lens. Tell us what needs to happen in both Washington and Beijing to put this relationship on a more stable path, and what's the stake, in your view, for the rest of the world?
Well, for the rest of the world, everything is at stake, because if the US-China relationship goes sour, you're going to have a state of tension, anxiety at the very least, and conflict possibly all over the world. Certainly all over the Asia-Pacific, or as now America prefers to call it, all over the Indo-Pacific. And that is going to be bad, not just for other countries, big and small, but for both America and China too, because both America and China are countries with enormous economic and technological power, with high-tech capabilities and weaponry and nuclear capabilities, and modernized armed forces in the case of the PLA, and the most powerful armed forces in the world in the case of the US armed forces, but not so powerful that when you go to war, you don't take casualties and expect to absorb a lot of damage. So if the two countries clash, I think everything is to be lost. And therefore, it's necessary for the two countries both to decide to work together and accept each other as they are, but work together and find common ground where they can cooperate. And there are many. Climate change is one where you are talking, and John Kerry has been to China already, but it can't just be climate change. You've got nuclear non-proliferation, you've got public health, you've got pandemics to come, you've got global trading needing to be on a stable basis in order that companies can import, export, trade, and develop the business and prosperity. And the two countries have to work together. But it means that both countries have to reconcile their international stances with their domestic political opinions, and both have domestic political opinions, even the Chinese, and overcome the nationalist instinct to say we will look after our country's interests, but we'll do so by cooperating with other countries, whether or not we fully trust them and whether or not they are our bosom friends. But they have to be our partners on this planet. And for China, that's a big deal, because the Chinese have reached a point where they feel that they've not only stood up and they've become wealthy, but they want to become strong and be acknowledged as such. But when you're strong, you're not the only strong guy in the world, and you have to know how to have that strength accepted by others over the long term, as the US has been able to do since the Second World War. And you have the most powerful fleets and aircraft and army but you have a lot of friends around the world. And people work with you not just because they're afraid of you, but because they think that there's room for them, you leave room for them, and you are doing good for the world, generally. And for the Chinese to adopt such an attitude, I think it takes time. For the US to accept that China is a fact that is not going to disappear, and you've got to work with it, and you can try to influence it, but you can't convert it. And it's not going to become like a European country, much less like the United States of America. I think that takes a lot of, it's a big psychological thing for America to accept. And it takes great statesmanship to make it work and to make Americans go along with such a policy. But that's what you need. And if you don't do that, and the two countries clash, neither is going to curl up and die. It's not like the Soviet Union. There's no Potemkin village in China. It's real. The vitality, the innovation, the drive, the prosperity, the determination to get ahead. And neither is America a declining and fading society. So somehow you have to come together. And I think that's the responsibility of statesmen on both sides.
Is there a wish on the part of Singapore or nations in Southeast Asia that the United States evolve its policy towards Asia outside the US-China context to perhaps rejoin the TPP or take other initiatives that you think would be important? And just briefly, because I want to also get to climate in this conversation.
Yes, of course. I mean, we would very much like you to rejoin the CPTPP, but we don't think it's on the cards. I mentioned talking about digital economy cooperation to establish norms and standards and for data transfer, for data transparency, for accountability, for where data has to be hosted. These are things which are not so contentious, but would be important in the new economy, or cooperation on the green economy, green financing or sustainability standards. These are things which we hope the US will have the bandwidth to put on the agenda.
Mr. Prime Minister, you spoke at the White House Climate Change Summit last month. So I just want you to quickly summarize some of your reflections. You've got countries in Southeast Asia are very dependent on coal and obviously other natural resources, but we have to take on the battle of climate change as a global community. What do you think is needed here now, and what can happen if we all work together?
Well, first of all, we should carry out what's been agreed in Paris. And the fact that the US has come back and will do its part, I think, is a big plus. Because if the US is not part of this, everybody else will say, why should I do my part? The US is free riding. But if the US is back, well, there's a possibility of doing what is in Paris. But honestly speaking, all the scientists believe that even if we did everything that is in the Paris Agreement, it won't be enough. And you have to go further, and you have to go further in a fair way with the big emitters making a big adjustment, and the other countries, big and small, each doing their part, including Singapore, which is not just small, but what we describe as alternative energy disadvantage, because you don't have hydro, you don't have geothermal, we can't have nuclear, there's no place to put the power plant. But we do have some sunshine, and we'll make the best of that, although the sunshine alone will not be enough. But to go beyond Paris, well, the next occasion will be the COP's meeting in Britain at the end of this year. And we hope that the countries will come with proposals to take things forward, and we will be there, and we hope to help the negotiations advance and to help Britain as chairman or president of the meeting make it a success. Everything is at stake because it's not just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, but what that means for sea levels, what that means for storms and droughts, what that means for coastal cities and low-lying areas, and what that means for war and peace, because climate change means total large social and economic disruptions and migrations and human conflict. And you can adjust to them over centuries. But if it happens within a few decades, I think you're putting humanity under stress.
Prime Minister, you have been very generous with your thoughts and reflections today. And I just want to say on behalf of everyone listening today, the important role that Singapore plays in the global economy, the important role that you have played personally in issues like the US-China relationship, trade, and many others. And I want to just thank you on behalf of the U.S. Chamber for participating today and sharing some of your thoughts. Time will leave it now with this interview, but we'll come back to you and hope to see you soon in person. Stay safe, and thank you for participating today.
Thank you very much.
Well, our next guest today really doesn't need an introduction. He's been thinking about the U.S.'s role in the world and the importance of U.S. global leadership, first as a business leader, then head of the Winter Olympics in 2002, as a governor, as a presidential candidate, and now as Utah's senator. Mitt Romney has been a leader for a lifetime in all the issues that we're discussing today, and we couldn't be more honored that he's agreed to join us today. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Neil. Good to be with you.
So I just want to jump right in. We're talking about U.S. global leadership. This is a topic, as I mentioned, that you spend a lot of time thinking about. Tell us what your view is of the status of U.S. leadership in the world today. How should we be thinking about it as we try to bring this global pandemic to an end? And what should it look like in a post-pandemic world?
Well, I think it's fair to say that post-pandemic, we have a bit of an opportunity. I say that because we've been on a long slide. Our leadership role is increasingly less and less important to the world. And that's not just because of our own decisions. It's also because China is aggressively asserting its path to leadership, and they are rising even as we have been trending in the other direction. Although what's happened with COVID has made a number of countries aware that the U.S. really is the nation to depend upon, and that if we want to play a role as a leader in the world, I think we'll be welcome to do so. China's rise is the result really of their economic resources, and those are resources which have built in part through predatory practices, particularly subsidized or predatory pricing, which allows them to put Western businesses out of business, other nations, likewise Eastern businesses out of business, and replace them with their own to also get monopolies on certain raw materials. These practices have added to the extraordinary resources they have. And then, of course, their strength is added by their Belt and Road investment, over $1 trillion in investments around the world to seize key raw materials as well as have access to markets. They've also established ports in the key choke points globally for trade, and then they've made investments in countries throughout the developing world. All these things have come to bring fruit to them. At the same time, we've been speaking about America first, withdrawing from international associations, and gone after some of our allies with pretty tough language, and so. What you're seeing is a stronger China, a weaker U.S. We're still stronger than they, but the trajectory is not a good one. And as you know, we've seen some 14 years where authoritarian regimes are rising, democracies are declining. So all these things are very threatening, but the opportunity presented by China's mismanagement of COVID is one which I hope we take advantage of.
So Sarah, I want to ask you to drill down a little bit deeper on both those points, and if you can, to maybe break it into two components. You just mentioned U.S. global leadership and America first versus engagement with our allies, and that calls for a strategy internationally, and I hope you'll opine a little bit on that. But there's also a lot of focus on what we might want to do domestically in the United States to be competitive. Can you give us your thoughts both on international engagement and what, if anything, we ought to be doing on the domestic side of the house in kind of this great competition?
Well, I'd start with our deciding what it is we want to be. And a friend of mine said, "What is our national ambition?" I know what China's national ambition is. It is by 2049 to have the most powerful military in the world, to have the leading economy of the world, and to be the geopolitical leader of the world, meaning to establish the practices and the bases upon which competition occurs globally. So that's their ambition. What is our ambition? What do we want to do over the coming decades? And as you know, prevent defense is not a great way to win a football game. It's not a great way to lead the world. So one is to establish very clearly what our ambition is. Number two, as you indicated, is to develop a very comprehensive strategy to achieve our ambition. We have not done that. We make tactical moves, but China has a strategy which they're pursuing very effectively. We don't. And so we need to bring some of our best thinkers, some from the public sector, some from the private sector, to say, what are our options here? How do we really make sure that we retain leadership in the world, and that liberal democracy and freedom is on the ascendancy, not in the decline? And I would, I'd note that we obviously have enormous advantages going for us, but there are things we're going to have to do if we want to maintain the leadership that we have. One is we got to link arms with our allies. We can't be fighting with Mexico and China and the EU and South Korea and Japan. We've got to come together and say we collectively are going to have to make sure that China understands what the rules of the road are, and that they cannot continue to exact their predatory behavior upon us, or they won't have access to our market. So that's number one. Number two, we have to lead the world in technology. We're a small country, all right, compared to China. They have 4 times our population. By definition, they will have a bigger economy than ours at some point, a lot bigger. And so how do we stay ahead? By having superior technology. And again, by linking arms with our friends and allies around the world in technology and in industry and in the military might that we would be able to amass together. So in terms of technology, yeah, we need to invest more in basic science in our country. Government should play a role in that and encourage businesses to do so through tax policy. I also think we'd be smart to say, look, if you graduated anywhere in the world in a key STEM subject that's important to us, we're going to let you come to our country and live here permanently. We'll give you a green card, whatever the status is. We want you to come here. This has always been the place people have wanted to come. And we ought to bring in the best and brightest that the world has to offer to keep us ahead from a technology standpoint. I would note that if we pass tax laws that make us a high tax nation, they won't want to come here. If we pass laws that say we're going to put huge capital gains taxes on inventors and innovators, they're not going to come to this country. They'll go somewhere else, which would be an extraordinary weakness that we would apply to our future. I'd also think that it's important that we market ourselves much better than we have. I'll end on that point. But we talk once upon a time about Radio Free Europe. Well, Radio Free Europe was probably a significant contributor to our interests when people used to listen to the radio. But we need to become far more effective in promoting freedom and our values around the world than we have been. China establishes TV stations in various nations around the world and then provides the content for the TV station. And we're asleep at the switch. So we need a strategy, and that'll help get us started.
Senator, when we think back to past foreign policy challenges that we faced as a nation, notably with the former Soviet Union, one of the hallmarks of the U.S. approach was that while each different president, including from different parties, had their own take on it, there was a kind of a common element that crossed administrations and kind of crossed parties. Do you think that's important as we think about our relationship and addressing the challenges that you just identified with China? And what do you think the prospects are for some type of bipartisan consensus, at least in the main, about the strategy that the U.S. should employ?
The good news is, I think there is the potential for that. Look, you're right. Ever since the Second World War, I mean, Harry Truman and Dean Acheson came together. Acheson wrote a book called Present at the Creation. they devised America's, if you will, foreign policy vision, which was, we are going to be the leader of the world. We are going to link arms with our friends around the world. We're going to promote our values around the world. And we do these things not just because we care about the rest of the world, but we care about ourselves. We do these because it's in our interest to be involved in the world. Because when we're not involved in the world, bad things happen that hurt Americans and that suck us into them. So, we're going to be involved in the world. I think there's a recognition on both sides of the aisle that that's important today. I think there is a recognition as of the last couple of years that China really does present an extraordinary threat to America and to liberal democracy generally, that we've been asleep at the switch, and that we're going to have to be far more aggressive in combining with our allies to make sure they understand what the rules are going to be. And if they don't live by those rules, that they don't get access to our markets. Those are things we're going to have to do. And I think there's a recognition that that's where we're headed. I'm pleased on the Foreign Relations Committee that Chairman Menendez and Ranking Member Risch really do see this eye to eye. They worked out a piece of legislation to push back on China. It's a good bill. I think it will pass. We're more together on this issue, I think, than certainly we were just 2 or 4 years ago.
Well, that is good news. In the few minutes we have remaining, I want to switch gears. In addition to your services ranking member that covers East Asia policy on the Foreign Affairs Committee, it also deals with cybersecurity policy. And the ransomware attack on the Capitol pipeline obviously got a lot of attention domestically in the last couple of weeks. But it's actually something that businesses of all sizes and in all industries in the United States deal with on a daily basis. What more should the U.S. government be doing today that it's not doing to confront these international criminal gangs who are targeting American businesses?
Well, the reality is that in many cases, in fact, in the great majority of successful hacking cases, it was not that the hackers had these extraordinarily brilliant people that were able to get by the most modern technology and techniques for protecting our systems. Instead, it's that our systems did not have the kind of cyber hygiene they should have had. And that's true in government, it's true in the private sector. About 85% of the successful attacks are as a result of enterprises not having the kind of up-to-date technology to protect their systems that they ought to have. And obviously there are companies that are expert in bringing people up to speed, but some of the most basic technology traits that we normally associate with protecting our systems are just not applied by many enterprises in government and throughout the country. That's about 85%. 15% are really difficult areas to protect. And if we get people to use the most modern techniques on the 85%, why then our specialists will be able to do a better job protecting us against the 15% that are really tough. And I would note here, banks that had a long history of protecting data, I mean, they know the importance of security and privacy. They haven't been subject to the kinds of successful attacks you've seen in government and throughout the rest of our economic systems. And so we need to learn from them. As I look at what the government can do, CISA, which is really the home for this, and the Department of Homeland Security, I think has to do a better job of collecting best demonstrated practices throughout industry and throughout government and promulgating them, making them available to businesses around the country, around the world for that matter. We can be a clearinghouse for not only where the attacks are occurring, but some of the available techniques we have to prevent those attacks from being successful. So I see CISA stepping up its game in terms of being a clearinghouse for best ideas, both for government and for the private sector.
Well, Senator, there's a lot more we could cover today, but that call for public-private partnership and confronting the challenges of cybersecurity is a great place to leave it on, because there's a lot of work to be done. On behalf of the U.S. Chamber and our audience gathered around the world, I can't thank you enough for taking a few minutes out of a busy schedule to spend with us today. Thank you, and let us know how we can help you in any of these endeavors.
Thank you so much. Keep on working hard. Get this economy going again, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. As governments and corporations make significant commitments to address the global climate challenge, our future energy mix will, of course, play a critical role. We're very fortunate, therefore, to have three expert voices with us here today to discuss how we power the recovery and the role a diverse energy mix will play. Jérôme Pécresse is CEO of GE Renewable Energy. Michael Sable is CEO, Executive Co-Chairman, and founder of Venture Global LNG. And Eric Oswald is Vice President for Strategy and Advocacy at ExxonMobil's Low Carbon Solutions. So to get right into the conversation, we know that meeting future global energy needs and emission reductions targets will require technology that can be affordably deployed at scale in the developing world. Each of your companies come at this challenge with different, though complementary solutions. So let me ask each of you to spend 3 to 5 minutes outlining your company's approach. And please use this time to discuss how your company came to that focus on your particular solution set and or your long-term vision for powering the future. So Jérôme, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Marty, and thank you and the Chamber for inviting me today to speak on this topic, which is so critical, both to addressing climate change and to helping our global economies recover from the pandemic. And I think it's invaluable to have an organization with the standing of the US Chamber of Commerce facilitating such discussions. Energy has been a business for GE since more than a century, and climate change is an urgent global priority that requires governments and businesses to work in partnership to accelerate the action. And large corporations like GE are best equipped to drive innovation with speed and to get to scale. So we think it's in our mission to play a critical role in helping the world through this global energy transition. At GE, we are optimistic. We think that with the right policy support, we can make a significant difference in addressing the issue through a strategic combination of renewable energy, gas, and modernized electricity grid. GE Renewable Energy, which is the business I lead, is one of the 4 GE businesses today, with more than $16 billion of global revenue. We are focused on helping our customers meet the challenges of transitioning to greater use of renewable energy in both the developed and the developing economies. And in both cases, we do that by a combination of actions that we probably will discuss later this morning. The first one is building, servicing, and maintaining the existing fleet of renewable energy assets, wind, solar, among others. The second is continuing to reduce the cost of renewable energy so that we can bring even more of it online sooner and cheaper. The third one, which is more and more important these days, is making renewable energy function more like traditional baseload power generation source. It means basically tackling the variability issue of the energy fuel. And the fourth one is ensuring grid resiliency and efficiency by maintaining reliable grid operations while bringing more renewable energy online to ensure there is enough supply to meet the demand at all times. And it's important that all stakeholders, including policymakers, understand the challenges and the opportunities here of putting each of these 4 levels in a coordinated manner. And I look forward to having that discussion with you and the other panelists today. There is one specific topic I would like to highlight to finish, which is offshore wind. Offshore wind will be the fastest growing segment in the energy space in the years to come, as confirmed by the IEA report that went out yesterday. At GE, we invested massively in that field with the development of our IADEX 13 megawatt turbine, which is the largest built in the industry. After having installed a few years ago the first ever US project, Block Island, we are now the supplier to Vineyard Wind, which is wind farm which got permitted recently thanks to the support of the Biden administration with that IADEX turbine. This will be the first large US offshore wind farm in the US. Offshore wind has all the reasons to be a strong part of the US energy mix in the decade to come and to create a very large amount of jobs in the country. And at the same time, that industry keeps growing globally with a steady flow of business in Europe and developing markets in Asia, such as Japan, South Korea, and China. Onshore wind, hydro, battery storage, and grid solutions are also critical part of the energy transition equation, and I look forward to discussing this later on. Thank you, Marty.
Great, thank you, Jérôme. Michael?
Sure, thank you, Marty. Thank you also to the Chamber. The Chamber does a great job, an important job in helping to lead and host and be part of these important conversations about policy and commercial aspects, and in our case, about the energy market. And it's really appreciated by us and by the broader commercial community. So thank you for doing such a great job with these. Venture Global, for the last 12 years, has really been on a mission to displace coal. And Bob Pender and I, when we launched Venture Global, was a new enterprise to break into a long-established LNG export industry, and we needed a way to be competitive in obviously a commodity market. And we, through various approaches and different approaches to configuration of our liquefaction plants that allowed us to push, actually with GE Oil and Gas, now Baker Hughes, use smaller liquefaction trains in our large baseload facilities that could be produced and fabricated and manufactured in factory settings, allowed us to substantially lower the cost of LNG and ultimately the gas for the customer. The critical component in the market, as the customers think about what source of fuel they use for power production, is really all about cost. And when they compare coal, which is generally the cheapest in the market, with other sources, the gas needs to be competitive with that. And so as we brought down the cost of LNG exports and the cost of liquefaction, the gas imported into these countries is more competitive with coal. And we've been able for the last 12 years to develop this approach and sign large global fuel contracts for delivery of fuel into Asia and into Europe. Gas is going to be a critical part of the long-term, the short, middle, and long-term transition to alternative energy production and energy uses. And Venture Global is committed to continuing to look for ways to lower the cost, to allow customers the flexibility either to displace coal or other sources, or use those savings to invest in offsets, sequestration, efficiency, or other aspects of the delivery of energy that allows for greater reduction in emissions, and ultimately to cycle around increasing production from renewable sources. We firmly believe that gas is essential to that transition until there are new developments and new inventions that allow for alternatives in order to increase the production from renewables. You have to have a baseload flexible source to do that. And obviously we view gas as the most attractive and the best alternative for that. And ultimately, all the alternatives require investment, and as a result, the cheaper all those sources and opportunities are, the better opportunity there is to choose a path that lowers emissions and gives greater flexibility, but still provide essential baseload energy to the growing appetite in the world. So I look forward to a great discussion on this panel. Thank you, Marty.
Great, thank you, Michael. Eric?
Thank you, Marty. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share some of the exciting work we're doing at ExxonMobil to help society move towards a lower carbon future. I'm Eric Oswald, Vice President of Strategy and Advocacy for ExxonMobil's new low carbon solutions business. Our goal is to create new businesses using our extensive portfolio of low carbon technologies, businesses that'll help achieve society's emission reduction ambitions. LCS is a new organization, but ExxonMobil is not new to low carbon ventures. Many of you will know that we're the global leader in carbon capture and storage, or CCS, and we've captured more CO2 than anyone in the world. We chose to focus on CCS now because we see it as a technology that's ready for safe, widespread application, a technology that's critical to achieving the emission reduction goals of the Paris Agreement, an effort we've supported since its inception, and a technology that could open doors for future energy solutions like hydrogen. As Bill Gates reminds us in his latest book, the goal isn't to use only renewable resources like wind and solar. The goal is to get to zero emissions. CCS plays a significant role in Mr. Gates' plan to get to zero because he realizes it's one of the few tools we have to address emissions in hard to decarbonize sectors of the economy. And for us at ExxonMobil, large CCS projects leverage not only our past experience, but our strengths in technology development and project management. Based on our analysis of the 2-degree scenarios developed by the IPCC, the market for CCS could top $2 trillion by 2040. We've hit the ground running with this new business, and we're evaluating and advancing plans for more than 20 new CCS opportunities around the world. Last month, we introduced a concept that could revolutionize the heavy industry area around the Houston Ship Channel. I think of it as a hub for energy innovation. It's a breathtaking endeavor, bringing together a large number of companies working with all levels of government, academia, and community leaders to effectively decarbonize one of the country's most important industrial areas. It begins with an effort to gather the CO2 emissions from several hard to decarbonize sources, sites that are making invaluable products for society. And with these decarbonized products, the hub could then act as a catalyst for new markets and innovations. Hydrogen is particularly interesting in this regard. Houston's ideally located for a major CCS project. The facilities along the Houston Ship Channel represent about 4% of the country's industrial emissions, a sector that's one of the hardest to decarbonize. The port is also the country's largest importer and exporter of goods to and from international markets. Houston's location along the Gulf of Mexico also provides direct access to excellent offshore storage locations. The U.S. Department of Energy estimates that the sandstones that lie thousands of feet beneath the seafloor have a capacity to safely store all of the CO2 for the entire country that they would produce for the next 100 years. As currently envisioned, the project would capture 50 million metric tons of CO2 by 2030 and twice that amount by 2040. That's equivalent to taking 20 million cars off the road every year and would put Houston well on its way to achieving a goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050. It's a massive idea, one that would create tens of thousands of jobs and cost more than $100 billion. So we'll need support from many different parties, both private and public, to succeed. Regulatory and legal support at all levels of government will be crucial for establishing incentives and attracting investment. We need Congress to allow for CO2 from non-coal sources to be stored offshore. Second, we need a significant increase in the production tax credits in Section 45Q to allow more difficult but abundant sources to be captured. And finally, we need government grants for transportation and storage infrastructure that will ultimately facilitate market growth. Will it be difficult? Yes. Is it possible? Absolutely. If we can get the right policy and regulatory framework in place to initiate this Houston hub, similar projects could follow. We would be building a foundation for innovation and competition to advance the transition to a lower carbon energy future while protecting jobs today and creating jobs for tomorrow. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to today's discussion.
Great, thank you, Eric. Let me go to some questions now. And Michael, I know Jerome mentioned in his remarks the report put out this week by the International Energy Agency. It was their roadmap for the global energy sector to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Obviously, an ambition shared by many governments and individual corporations. But I was somewhat struck, at least in the reports on the roadmap, that it seemed to focus on a relatively narrow set of tools to consider. Meaning it looked like they appeared to minimize the role of nuclear, carbon capture, and even natural gas as part of the solution set for the power sector. So if the shared goal is for us to reduce emissions as far and as fast as we can, what's your view, Michael, on how we get there? And any comment on the IEA report?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you for that, Marty. Obviously, we read that closely, and the IEA report highlighted, many things that need to be done that they, I guess, indirectly recommend to be done by many industries in order to hit these ambitious targets. Just last year, the IEA attributed environmental success in parts of the world, and particularly in the U.S., that derive from switching from coal to natural gas. So the IEA has highlighted that in the past, and we view it as impossible to achieve these targets without gas, unless or until, which we hope for, there are new discoveries and new inventions that allow us to do it in new ways that we can't predict today. But if we, in our view, if we continue to invest in gas and support through policy and investment the efficient, low-cost export of gas to countries that have entirely inadequate infrastructure today to support increases in renewables and pursuing other ways to reduce emissions, the fastest and surest way to reduce emissions is through natural gas and in particular LNG exports in those countries that don't have access to pipeline gas or their own gas. And even at 2050, until there are new inventions, gas is going to be a requirement to support the renewable infrastructure that will surely be much larger at that point. But the demand for global energy is going to continue to grow and accelerate, and in particular in Asia, which I think by 2050 will have 70% of the global energy demand. If we don't support gas exports, you're going to have a lot of renewables and you're going to have a lot of coal, and relying on an unknown technology breakthrough is going to make it harder to hit those targets or delay them significantly. And so to us, it makes a lot more sense to take advantage of the opportunities that were super successful in the United States in displacing coal with gas, and we need to support that for Asia.
Great, thank you. Jerome, obviously the report focused quite a bit on renewables, so I want to give you an opportunity as well, both to ask you what you see as the future global energy mix, including the role of natural gas, but comments on the IEA report itself as well.
Yeah, sure. I think clearly the future over the next decade is going to show a lot of growth of renewable energy with a continued role of gas to balance the equation, and with a big variable in the system, which is how fast will the cost of battery storage come down, and how fast is the performance of battery storage going to improve, which is going to be a big parameter that is going to move the needle. I think everybody would agree that there is still a large growth of renewable energy ahead, with still the four challenges I mentioned. First one is, and four levers at the same time. The first one is, how do we improve the way we run our existing fleet of assets for renewable, wind and solar, particularly by using digital tools that can allow to extract more and more value from the existing base of assets. The second lever is about continuing to reduce the cost of renewable energy, wind and solar. I think the industry has clearly surpassed expectation on that front, but there is still more we can do in bringing down the cost of wind electricity, in particular with innovation. We are now as a source of energy cheaper than fossil fuels in many markets of the world, but we can continue to go down with innovation on turbine design, on wind farm optimization, and in manufacturing technologies. So there is still a lot ahead on the front of innovation. The third lever is to move renewable to a traditional baseload power generation source. And that's going to be about how do you use and leverage developing storage technology like battery storage? How do you maximize the use of hydro pump storage, which can be a significant factor to put at play, including in the US? And how do you combine wind and solar together and with storage to get to higher level of utilization of renewable energy assets? And the fourth lever, which recent events in Texas have shown is very important, and that we don't want to lose sight of, is the issue of the grid resiliency and efficiency. We need, while we grow renewable, to maintain reliable grid operations and to make sure that the grid can accommodate this growing and growing renewable content. And here there are a lot of solutions that we can bring to the table in terms of hardware, software, services, and there is a large investment program ahead that was recognized recently by the Biden administration that is dedicated to extend, modernize the grid and connect the grid systems together. So that I think the 4 key levers, Marty, to how can you, bring to reality the scenarios of, for example, the International Energy Agencies on renewable growth in the decades to come.
Great, thank you. And Eric, let me ask you. I to give you an opportunity to any comments on the IAA report, but more specifically, the report it showed or projected a fairly small role for CCS in the power sector. You touched on some of the policies that are needed to help facilitate, but what are some of those really significant dynamics that are necessary to facilitate both CCS and carbon removal technologies and what have you, to help meet our future energy mix?
Yeah, so a few ideas in there. I always start with the dual energy challenge, and there are risks associated with missing either of those challenges. The first being to supply the world with affordable energy, and the second to address the risks associated with climate change. So I take exception a little bit to the EIA approach of working on supply rather than demand, and I don't think we're in a position where we can put at risk the supply of affordable energy. So there's still investment required to make sure we make that transition. As far as CCS goes, just to put some context around there, they were looking at numbers of sort of several gigatons or billions of tons of sequestered carbon by, say, 2030, 2040 in the mid frame of the 2050 progression. And I think up to 7 or 8 gigatons, billions of tons of carbon sequestered by 2050. So that really puts our project in context. Remember, 100 million tons annually, which is pretty much the largest proposed project, not implemented, but proposed project. So it just puts the challenge, I think, in clear light. As I described Houston Hub for you, be thinking that the world needs to execute something like 40 or 50 of those in the next year, and remember the kind of costs that we talked about. So I think it's an opportunity, but it's also something that we have to address and kind of get after seriously. To that end, I'm up in Washington, D.C. this week, starting conversations with the policymakers who will clearly play a big role. And, we've had some very interesting conversations. We're talking about 45Q, which some of you will know is the tax mechanism that supports sequestration, and that requires modifications to scale up to what we're trying to do here. We've also talked about infrastructure investment, having the government make initial investments in infrastructure to create the new market, looking what those opportunities look like. And then finally, there's a whole suite of regulatory issues, from access and liability all the way down to regulating the wellbores that would be involved in injecting the CO2. Right now, surprisingly enough, the regulations around injecting CO2 into the ground are about the same as injecting nuclear waste into the ground. And especially if you're talking about injection offshore, 60 miles offshore, you're not worried about drinking water or anything like that. So we'll need some streamlining in how we're managing the regulation of those wells.
Great, an excellent perspective. Jerome, if I could come back to you for a moment from a global standpoint, curious what you see as some of the major challenges in building a resilient green energy mix, and how those challenges may be different or similar in developed versus developing markets.
I think that from a technical standpoint, they are quite similar markets. What this challenge I said about cost of renewable energy, able to bring more baseload renewable energy into the system, resilience of the grid. You can find this challenge in many places of the world. The grid is a weakness in the developing market, but even in the US, as we have seen recently, the grid needs modernization and investments. I think where it gets a bit different is to do all these renewable projects you need two things in addition of what I said. You need funding, and you need stability of policy support. And you need that in the developed and the developing world. I would say in the developed world, I mean, more funding will be needed, but the policy support is more stable. In the developing markets, we see a significant amount of funding still available, but we need more stability of policy support. When people invest in a wind farm, they want guarantee of the regulatory regime for 10, 20 years. So I think the technology issues are the same. The mix of policy stability and funding that you need is probably different depending if you speak about the developed world or the developing markets.
Great. Well, Michael, building on that, looking at I know you're obviously speak with customers and prospective customers around the globe, and wonder if you can share what they believe is needed for them to meet both their energy needs and emission reduction expectations, and are there specific policies in the U.S. that we should consider to help those markets meet their needs?
No, thank you, Marty. For the last 10 years, we've been speaking with energy customers and governments in various countries every day for 10 years. And Eric touched on it. There's a growing insatiable appetite for energy as the global middle class population explodes, which is a great thing for the world. And they have huge demand for energy, and one way or another, they're gonna get the energy. And so in order to do it successfully from the perspective of supply and of affordable energy, but also managing the emissions downsides, we need all of the above approach from an energy standpoint. The developing world, where most of this growth is occurring, does not have the infrastructure to support renewable energy, and so it makes it a lot more expensive. So until there's a global agreement that supports more of that investment as quickly as possible, you're going to get more coal if you don't support affordable gas exports and the associated infrastructure. So to have the surest, most significant impacts on emissions while also meeting that energy demand, so you don't get long-term investment in coal plants, and this has been successful in the U.S., you need to support those gas exports. So from a policy perspective, we need policies that support consistent long-term reliable supply of LNG gas. We need the liquidity of the markets broadly to continue to improve, that lowers costs and allow more investments in carbon sequestration, in renewables, in efficiency. And so consistent, reliable, supportive policy is important for the customers. Otherwise, they'll do more coal than we want them to do.
Thank you. And Eric, in our final 2 minutes here, if I could ask you, I'm really intrigued with the announcements you made on the innovation zone and the concept of the hub. What's not just the progress, you touched on that a bit, but what's the reaction been in the Houston area and the industrial partners that you've been working with and inviting into this I think really exciting project?
Yeah, we've had great response from the potential participants. I think we've worked our way through communicating almost all there's about 50 companies involved in the larger project. Local politicians, from the mayors all the way up through state officials have, of course, been very positive on it. We've also had discussions with the administration at very high levels. They're very positive and very supportive. You heard Janet Yellen, I think, yesterday made comments in support of CCS. So I think it's an idea whose time has finally arrived. It's something we've been talking about for a long time. So I'm encouraged by the tone of the conversations here. But I'm also, realistically, it's a very tough legislative conversation, and there's a lot of really difficult conversations ahead with Congress to figure out how to actually work these funding mechanisms. So I think there's a lot of work ahead, but I think the time has arrived, and it has arrived with the kind of goals that we've signed up here for.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And let me, on behalf of the Chamber and our entire audience, Eric, thank you, Michael and Jerome. Great conversation today. A lot more to talk about, obviously, but appreciate your time and your commitment to this issue. and we look forward to working with you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Justin Warland. I'm a senior correspondent at Time Magazine, where I write about climate change and with a focus on policy, politics, and how it's reshaping the world around us. I'm thrilled to be moderating this discussion on sustainable recovery with this, which should be a very interesting panel. Dr. Ilhan Kadri is the CEO and chairman of the executive committee at Solvay, which is a materials, chemicals, and solutions company. And she has a long and distinguished career with a range of multinationals in this area, as well as Tom Bell, who's the chairman and CEO of Rolls-Royce North America, as well as president of Rolls-Royce Defense, and has a long and distinguished career in aviation and defense as well. It's a really interesting time for this discussion, with dynamic discussion happening on sustainability, on climate, and of course, how these things piece together with the economic recovery that is necessary across the globe. Just to set the stage, I'm going to ask each of them a bit about what their company is doing in this area, and then we'll get into some broader discussion. And I'll start with Dr. Kadri. Solvay launched a program called One Planet last year, which is focused on climate, resources, and the quality of life, and thinking about how to improve them with a circular ecosystem. So can you just tell us a bit about what this program is and how it works?
Yeah, well, of course, first, thank you, Justin. I'm very delighted to be here with you today. To jump right into the topic, indeed, we released last year Solvay Sustainability Roadmap we call Solvay One Planet. It's in fact an integral part of our business strategies, and it impacts, by the way, the pocket. So our bonuses for all employees, both on the yearly variable remuneration, including my pockets, and the long-term incentive on the greenhouse gas emission reduction. So concretely, Solvay One Planet is structured around the three pillars you just mentioned: climate, resources, and better life. And we have 10 measurables goals to be achieved by 2030, but we report every year the non-financials, performance along with our financial performance. And it was first year we disclosed it in our annual reports. To give you some example on the climate front, and actually I was listening to the former panel to make the link with the energy. We are rolling out energy transition plans across all our business and adapting to local markets and regulation. Last February, we joined the Paris Agreement and we joined the Science-Based Target in October. To give you an idea, our trajectory between 14 and 18 was shy of minus 1% savings every year on greenhouse gas emissions. And in 19 and 20, since the launch of Solvay One Planet, we reached 4% structural savings, which is a 2x the average annual savings required by the Paris Accords. So an example, the United States, we have three businesses which switched to 100% solar power since January 2021. We have 250,000 solar panels now in the US, and we're amongst the top 10 US manufacturing companies with solar capacity. To give you an idea, this represents 15,000 homes of annual power. And while we power our factories in the area, we cut the equivalent of 80 kilotons of CO2 emissions. So it's great. Our customers, they love it. Your smartphone you are using, it's powered by solar energy thanks to Solvay inside. And like the US, we have 28 different energy transitions around the world, which we will be active by in the next 18 months. And this will allow Solvay globally to reduce emissions by 1.8 million tons of carbon dioxide. And it will be completed fully in the next 3 years. The second pillar, resources. You said it, Justin, we are committed to accelerate the circular economy and to increase the sustainable solutions, to 65% of the group sales. Let me give you an example I love. It's our natural vanillin products. We use rice husk, which is discarded. This is the skin of the rice, right, which goes to the bin. And we produce natural vanillin, which gives taste to your birthday cakes. So when you reuse the waste, it's not a waste anymore. And that's the future of circularity. It's just the beginning. And we have now a growing platform around EV batteries as we enable lightweight and membranes. In electrical batteries, we have green hydrogen growth platform and thermoplastic composites, which is recyclable. And the last one to finish with is Better Life. Is about people, obviously. Which is very close to our hearts. A simple example around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We extended the parental leave early January this year to all co-parents to 16 weeks, regardless where you work, your country of origin or work, and regardless of the gender and the sexual orientation. So that's Solvay One Planet. It's a roadmap. It's part of who we are. It's part of our business strategies. It impacts the pockets. It's a journey. It's a transformation. It actually addressed the sense of urgency on climate, scarcity of resources, and of course it has to be profitable, and for us it is profitable, and it's the starting point. So I stop here, as I know I will have the opportunity to expand on this later. Back to you, Justin.
Yes, there are a lot of points to pick up on in there, but for now let's turn to Tom and just to ask, Rolls-Royce has set a 2050 net zero target within your operations. Could you just tell us a bit about, what this looks like? How do you plan for that? And how has this changed the way you think about your business model?
Thank you, Justin. Much appreciated, and like my colleague, thrilled to be with you all today. At Rolls-Royce, we hold ourselves a high chinning bar when it comes to all of these things, under the guise of we are pioneers of the power that matters. And one of the reasons that vision statement for me makes so much sense is the inherent question in the statement, pioneers of the power that matters, matters to who? Matters to the world, matters to our customers. And so as we emerge from this global pandemic and we talk about global growth again, it's critical that we are providers of the power that matters for the world. And so in that regard, you're absolutely right. We've held ourselves to a very high hurdle of being carbon neutral in our operations by 2030. And by 2050, making sure that all of our products are capable of being run on either sustainable alternate fuels or are zero carbon themselves. So we've got two very near-term objectives. 2050 in our industry is very near term. 2030, be carbon neutral ourselves in our operations. 2050, make sure all of our products can be carbon neutral. How are we doing in that regard? Well, we're making great progress. We've installed tens of thousands of solar panels in our facilities globally. We're about to cut the ribbon on a microgrid in our manufacturing facility in Bristol, England. Our manufacturing facility in Aiken, South Carolina is not too far behind that in terms of a sustainable microgrid. And then we're committed to, in the next couple of years, our major manufacturing plant in Indianapolis being carbon neutral. And so as you can see, we're taking a multi-pronged approach to make sure we're responsible citizens, and then we're making sure that our products are responsible so that our customers can be responsible to their customers.
Well, well, first off, my apologies for misstating the year. Is a significant difference. Well, I want to ask a bit about, Dr. Kadri, you finished with this point about what has to be profitable, and Tom, you spoke, about the reasons, the powerful reasons behind this. But just to ask a little more, what do you see as the most significant drivers of these changes for you? I mean, there's a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different reasons why you might want to pursue such changes, but it would be interesting to see what you think is driving it. And we can just start with Dr. Kadri and then. move forward?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think I believe that more and more customers, they want it. And the customers, they want this. Our employees, right? The millennials, I'm not a millennial anymore, but I'm a mother, right? Our kids, they want it, right? So you say that the stakeholders are here, and I believe in the 3 Ps, the people, planet, and the profits. It's not in contradiction. That's how we see it at Solvay. So I believe that the climate, and resources sense of urgency and action is good for the economy and for the business. Look at the electrification, right? I mean, when Tesla started, I mean, many didn't believe it's going to be a great success. And look at how the EV and technologies and electrification is growing rapidly, including during COVID-19. That was the largest, fastest growing business we had last year in Q4 and still booming in Q1. So lowering the carbon footprint of products and solution is becoming a selling point for brand owners and in the value chain across automotive, consumer goods and so on. And touching upon, the climate urgency earlier, facts are talking for themselves. We have reached a point of no return, and this is really reshaping the consumers' ask and the politics globally. So, at the end of the day, we have one planet, like Solvay one planet, and then there will be no jobs on a dead planet. So we believe that, it's now comes the time to really act, and it's an opportunity again for innovations, for science, because we are a science-based company. We want to lead on those 3 Ps. Joining, for example, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, we did it last October after we announced the sustainability roadmap. It's a bigger ambition than us. We don't know yet how to do it all, right? Like we pledged that we're exiting coal, which is a big deal for Solvay because this company started 160 years ago with coal as a primary energy. And you talked about energy across the world. There's still a lot of usage of coal and investments in coal, and we are exiting coal. And we just announced a few weeks ago that our first plants, exiting coal is now on stream through biomass, so waste wood chips, right? Which is also good for the planet, but profitable because we engage with the German authorities and we had a public-private collaboration in building the ecosystem. And the last but not the least, obviously the suppliers, like many companies, we are adopting the SBTi, what we call scope 3, which means that we are assessing the emission across the value chain, from cradle to grave or to cradle, from suppliers to customers. That's important. And customers we have, as a stakeholder, I have the beautiful example in the US, while a US client requires that the power consumed in our manufacturing process come from renewable. And this is why we invested in solar, and we became one of the largest solar farmer in the US. And finally, investors, let's not forget them. Climate-related, challenges are becoming a risk, and they want to de-risk their investments, but they see it also as an opportunity mid and long term. So it's a hot topic, frankly. Since I joined the company 2 years ago, and after the Davos, live meeting in Switzerland in January, just before the lockdown, where climate was a hot topic, all investors are talking about ESG matters and about climate. So investors choose us according to certain criteria, like ESG ones, but we also choose them as well. And it's a two-way process where the environment, the social, and the governance pillars are key. Back to you.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, Justin, thank you. So like all industries right now, I think across all of Rolls-Royce's markets, we're seeing tremendous interest and pull for sustainable solutions. To step back a little bit, we're in 3 broad markets: civil aviation and business jets. So we make the engines for 787s or A350s or Gulfstream business jets. We're in power systems, which makes reciprocal engines for land moving equipment, rail trains, and standby power for Amazon, Google, and like that. And then defense. In all of those markets, we're seeing and an unstoppable drive toward sustainable solutions. Our customers, be they the business jet customers or the airlines, they want engines that can fly on sustainable aviation fuels. Our customers in rail and our customers for standby power, they want non-fossil fuel alternatives to provide those powers for their needs. And we're invested heavily in hybrid trains, and we're invested heavily in microgrids and bringing about future alternative opportunities for those same standby power and microgrids to be powered by non-fossil fuels. And even in defense, where you might think that the defense customer is lagging society, we see in our core markets defense customers who are eager to have a conversation about a decarbonization future and how that decarbonized future might give them the strategic advantage of untethering them from the very fragile, very costly fossil fuel supply chain on which they rely today. And so across all of our markets, Justin, we see customers not only receptive to our conversations about pioneering the power that matters and how that changes over time, but we see them actually starting to pull on us and say, how can you bring that about faster? How can we help you? How can we partner with you to make sure that we bring about this in a globally leading fashion, not a lagging fashion and catching up?
Well, very interesting answers. One thing, you know, investors, customers, et cetera, we heard from both of you, but not so much about government. And I'm curious, you know, obviously the chamber is a policy shop, and you know, what role government should play in your view in facilitating and also setting rules of the road along this transition. And so I guess, you know, we're in a very dynamic policy space and in time right now, obviously. And I'm just curious what you would like to see in that regard, and perhaps what you wouldn't want to see in that regard. And maybe we'll start with Tom in the US, and then we can look at the global picture after that.
Yeah, that's fair. We'll go for me first.
Sorry,
I have three things that I would mention, Justin, that I think are going to be critical to bring about as rapid change as possible in our industries. First is incentivizing these sustainable alternate fuel production. It's wonderful that, you know, yesterday an Air France jet left Europe and landed in Canada on sustainable aviation fuel. In this particular case, it was kitchen grease that was repurposed. But let's be honest, we all don't want to eat enough French fries to feed that stock, right? That's not healthy for the world. And so how are we going to really bring to scale sustainable alternate fuels for all the gas turbines that we have today and all the automobiles that we have today? It's not beyond the wit of man. It just requires scale. In this regard, the FAA and NASA, there should be policies for them to be investing in and leading us through how to create this sustainable future in a more robust way than natural. And then last but not least, we really do need our tax code to ensure there's incentive for investment in the technologies that are going to both get us to our 2030 goals, but also our 2050 goals. So standardization, some help with governments like NASA and FAA, and then of course some tax regimes that help us invest in this very, very noble future.
Well, that's great. That's I guess, you know, Dr. Kadri, I'd ask you the same question. I'm curious your thoughts about the US, but also if you want to think a little bit about, I mean, obviously both companies are global companies, but I'd be curious, you know, you're based in Brussels, and, you know, to get your sort of global assessment as well.
Yeah, indeed. Solvay really a global company, well distributed, 1/3 in Europe, 1/3 in Americas, mainly the US, and 1/3 in Asia. Well, first of all, as a general first step, we have signed the open letter launched by the We Mean Business, right, with 400 other business and investors calling for a reduction of US emissions by at least 50% by 2030, with early climate neutrality as a North Star. So very happy that the Biden administration is back to the Paris Accords, and this is aligned with our Solvay One Planet agreement. Second, something probably more controversial in the US is the carbon pricing. Understand that this is not universally supported by all stakeholders in the US, but let me share with you why we support it if done correctly, especially where the program is transparent, technology neutral, market-based, and provides regulatory certainty to stakeholders and ensure a level playing field. The existence of carbon pricing in the EU has enabled us, as I mentioned earlier, to switch one of our oldest plants in Germany, Rheinberg, from coal to biomass fired, making the site now, you know, the new global benchmark for low carbon soda ash. And carbon pricing, when I joined the company 2 years ago, was around the 20-ish euro a ton. Now it's at 50. So it's really, you know, supporting and accelerating innovation. The other example is electric batteries or vehicles or hybrids. At this stage in the technology evolution, we see real value in comprehensive policy to encourage adoption of emission-reducing technologies. The good news is that leapfrogging and disrupting, you know, the giant automotive, the old school, has happened from the US. So very interesting. And we agree with the American Chemistry Council that the US should encourage deployment of EVs and recharging infrastructure, because we need infrastructure, right? I mean, we cannot do it alone. We lighten a car. We are a key part in the battery, in the EVs. We are in aerospace, by the way, as well, like Rolls-Royce, but we need infrastructure. And this is where governments and policies can support to develop, you know, infrastructure, local for local strategy, wherever possible. We certainly support policies aimed at encouraging the purchase of EVs as well, right? And benefiting and targeting public funding to encourage private sector investments, including in the US. And then more holistically, policies that encompasses the entire life cycle should be a goal. I think not only focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the tailpipe for vehicles, but also looking at the end of life, like recycling batteries, where we can stop just wasting and producing products and putting them in the bin. You know, we don't throw our textile and our costumes, we use them. Why not reimagining and reinventing products to have a second life? And this is the new innovation, and it's more than recycling, it's really creating this circular economy. So I believe that the world is in the beginning stage of this transformation. Some people call it transition. I like to call it transformation. We need energy, we need firm policies, we need infrastructure, we need support to bring those innovation and to make them at scale. Like green hydrogen, we are, you know, a key enabler to go from gray to blue to green, but green is based 100% on renewables. It has to be more cost competitive and at scale. And for that, we need an ecosystem, we need the authorities, we need other players, because again, we cannot do it alone. And the US public authorities, but also in Europe with the Green Deal, will find a great partner in the chemical industry in general, because I used to call it the mother of all industries, right? Because which no matter how you slice it, it will play a pivotal role in ensuring US competitiveness and the sustainable developments and manufacturing, you know, innovations like EVs and hydrogen in the future.
Well, because I directed that question about the global picture, I just wanted to ask Tom, do you have anything to add on the sort of global picture, you know, beyond the US that I asked earlier, the regulatory picture?
Well, it's not so much regulatory as I would pick up on standardization. Obviously, you know, the airplanes we power, the Airbus and Boeing airplanes we power, they don't stay within a country very often. They go from country to country. And so if we're going to reach this objective of a sustainable future, and you accept the fact that you can't do those flights on electrical or hybrid power in the near term, the technology is not going to be there for that. The answer is these sustainable alternate fuels. But to do that, ICAO and our international regulatory bodies that have helped us create one of the safest travel means on the face of the earth have a role to play in ensuring that the global standards about these sustainable alternate fuels is there, so that when the jet touches down in a foreign country, thus they can also fuel up with a compatible fuel there, as opposed to within one nation. Like most things about sustainable futures, it's never in the confines of any one country. It is a global problem, and so it requires global scale, global cooperation, and global standards for setting these standards for the fuels.
Well, we have just under 5 minutes remaining, and I figured I might just ask, for a little bit of reflection, thinking, the last 5 years have been incredibly dynamic in the way in which sustainability has risen, everywhere. And I'm just curious, if you were to look into your crystal ball and think about your business, think about your business's engagement in the policy space, but just broadly to think about what do you think the next 5 years will look like on sustainability, and what should it look like? And if you just a quick 2-minute answer from each of you would be really appreciated. And we can start with Doc. Oh, go ahead, Tom. Yes, sorry.
I'll go first, just since I am. If we look back 5 years, we didn't have the statement "pioneering the power that matters." That's new. And it was created as we started to think forward toward a future that was going to demand more sustainable solutions for our growth and for the planet's growth. If I think about the last 18 months and what we've gone through with COVID-19, the decimation of some of our core markets has only accelerated our resolve that mission statement and doubling down on pioneering the power that matters is the key to come out of this stronger. And so what have we been doing? We've been investing more and more of our R&D in these technologies. Right now, almost 50% of our R&D dollars are spent on lower or low carbon technologies. And we have a medium-term goal that within very short number of years, 75% of our R&D that we invest in ourselves is going to be for low, lower, or no carbon solutions. And so the last 5 years have been a journey. It's been accelerated by the last 18 months of phase one of this global pandemic. And I believe if we continue to manage ourselves and be bold about the future, it can prove to be a great runway to a better future for all of us.
Excellent.
So you asked 5 years ago, and you may remember Justin, that just a bit longer than 5 years ago, the Paris Accords were launched, right? And at that time, people didn't know how and when and if it's going to be sticky. Now it's becoming a reference, and it's enabled the Green Deals of Europe to happen. So I echo what was said before: is cooperation is key. And I applaud to see US, Europe, Japan, and China, and many more countries agreeing with 2030 targets or early climate neutrality ambitions. Together, these countries represent 50% of the world emissions. This coalition will have a great impact for the people and the planet. And let's hope that the COP26 in November this year is not going to be a disappointment. And we're going to really, craft all together this journey to zero, which is still challenging. We don't know how to do it, but cooperation is an enabler. And the second point in my mind is the global alignment. And as the US looks to delineate, its path to its 2030, 2050 greenhouse gas emission targets, we are hopeful that policymakers will keep in mind how important it is to work with other developed nations, right? And the more aligned these policies are, the better, right? Because we run global companies, we have global assets. It's important for us we have global supply chains, right? To leverage capital investments. So it's extremely important to have more and more these alignments. And finally, is the power of innovation. I think innovation has helped humanity to progress and will reinvent and reimagine progress. We're talking about flying. I mean, we were part of the solar aircraft, which made the world tour without droplets of kerosene with 600 parts of Solvay. And we did that, right? In Q3, we will be part of the electronic air taxi, which will be enabled to carry 4 passengers and 1 pilot at a cruise speed of 240 kilometers per hour. Impressive. So it's not science fiction. And I think innovation, human ingenuity, scientists, this reality will make this reality much closer than we think. And this is just fabulous. Back to you.
Well, thank you to you both. A very interesting discussion. And we're out of time, so I won't recap it, but I feel like there was a lot that I learned and a lot to dig deeper into, so I appreciate it. And with that, I'll conclude the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for attending the Chamber's Global Forum on Economic Recovery. Over the past 2 days, we've heard from leading voices in the United States and around the world on what it will take to move beyond the challenges we've faced this past year. The public health and economic crises brought on by COVID-19 have affected every corner of the globe, and the solutions to overcome them must be global as well. Next, we're delighted to welcome a leading voice on many of the topics we've explored during this forum. Bill Gates needs no introduction. He's a renowned business leader and one of the most impactful philanthropists in the world. We have a lot we want to ask him, so let's get right to it. So here we have signs of recovery in some corners of the world, but we're also witnessing just a terrible crisis unfold in India, which, as you well know, could quickly spread to other countries. We've seen the power of public-private partnerships, including the work of your foundation, to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, and that's certainly the case with India right now. What lessons are you taking, should we all take, from the current situation that we can apply when the next crisis hits?
Well, in terms of pandemics, it wasn't high enough on the list of things that we practiced for and had a clear script on what we would do when it struck. And so it got, up into very high levels, and sadly, our only way of stopping that spread was to reduce economic activity, including things like school. So, the deficits that we created will be digging out of for a long time. The good news is that the innovation, particularly on vaccines, was faster than ever, even faster than people like Dr. Fauci and myself led people to expect. So within a year of the time of seeing the virus and knowing its sequence, several companies, starting with Pfizer and Moderna, had vaccines that have proven to be incredibly effective and are now getting out in very large numbers. So the lights at the end of the tunnel, we still see in the U.S. Often more than 500 people dying a day. So until we get those vaccine numbers up close to 80%, we're still going to have significant pockets of disease. But, we've learned about innovation and collaboration. I can say with great certainty, we've learned a lot that will help us for the next pandemic. And by making some investments in R&D and in having factories available, having surveillance and a big team of experts on a global basis, we will next time handle something like this without anywhere near the damage that we had to go through.
Well, we certainly are all pulling for that. When you think about health systems, and globally health systems, what investments do you think are going to be necessary to make that true?
Well, the two key investments, which are probably only a few billion a year, which, given that the cost has been trillions, is a pretty good insurance policy. It's to have a well-trained workforce of epidemiologists that are looking at these outbreaks when they're still very small. And you have to have a lot of surveillance. The diagnostic tools have gotten cheaper. They can look for all the different respiratory pathogens. And so we can kind of have a census and see, okay, what's out there that's spreading human to human, and then look and see, okay, is a variant coming up that is causing lots of sickness and lots of death. Now, so we may find that it's a variant of the flu, which has always been scary, or it could be some pathogen that we hadn't identified as super risky, but when we catch it in that surveillance network, we can act to activate diagnostic tools, activate getting the interventions, including vaccines and therapeutics and drugs. So surveillance managed by a team of 3,000 professionals under the WHO, that's kind of the global level investment. Then, for the US, given our incredible expertise in medical innovation, we'll have to devote some of the research budget to these areas, finding a blend of funding academic research and incentivizing the private sector who has a lot of the capabilities, including practical challenges like antiviral libraries or techniques where you can start to make lots of antibodies in, say, 30 days instead of 6 months. That'll have to be a private public partnership to build up those capabilities that the market doesn't demand, but the private sector skills can help us develop so that it will have a dramatic impact in any future pandemic.
It's such an important point. I remember when we were interviewing Dr. Fauci earlier, and he said, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and science and the private sector will lead the way. And that's exactly what you're saying now. And then I guess it leads me to the next question, which is about climate. You've been studying climate and energy issues for a long time. Your book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, was just released in February. Is the same idea, the same technology and innovation a part of that solution?
Absolutely. There are some things in common. We need government to think ahead to what the bad scenarios are and then make the right investments. In the case of the pandemic, we didn't see it coming, but once it hits, then you're just seeing, the horrific number of deaths. With climate change, it just gets worse every year. And so the, storm events, the flooding, the crop failures, particularly in the hotter parts of our country, the wildfires. And so it kind of sneaks up on you, but the lead time to fix it is far, far longer than it is to invent a new vaccine, because here with climate, we have an installed base of how we do power generation, how we make cement and steel, how we power our cars and planes and trucks. And every one of those things has to change to a green approach. And when we first go and do that, the extra cost, say for green steel or green cement, it's dramatically more expensive. Although, I absolutely believe with innovation that every one of the categories, that extra cost for being green, which I say is the green premium, that can be brought down. Now we need to use all the tools here, R&D for the early stage, venture capital for first commercialization, but then also some degree of purchase requirements or tax credits, money from philanthropists and companies to create a market, to try to get that volume up and create a learning curve so that, there's enough demand for clean, say, aviation fuel because companies are wanting to offset whatever their employee travel is generating, that leads to more and more capacity and more understanding of how we get that cost to be not much more than or the same as what aviation fuel has cost when we didn't care about the emissions that it caused.
It's so interesting because if you think about, we're talking about this once in a century, we hope, global pandemic we're facing. And then we think about this massive challenge of climate change that we were just discussing. And yet we're balancing these investments with a precarious economic recovery. So here we are closing out a global forum with thousands of people from more than 100 countries who've been thinking about how do you have a broad-based recovery, both globally, how do we help different countries along that may be having a harder time up that economic recovery scale, or even within countries, how do we make sure that the most disadvantaged communities are taken care of? So it's just this balancing of short-term problems, long-term problems at a precarious time in our economy. So what are you thinking about this broad-based and global recovery?
Well, sadly, the negative impacts were far worse for the poor countries versus the rich countries, and those who are worse off within the rich countries. They didn't have the internet connection to continue learning. They didn't have the space in the home to get the kind of quiet that a student requires. The schools they attend were much slower to shift over to the online. And so, we're very lucky that to some degree, the macroeconomic environment, allowed in rich countries where the U.S. is actually the largest, allowed us to step up with increased government spending. So if we spend that money well, not only do we take the pandemic deficits, but we take some of the inequities that have always been a concern and start to make some progress towards those. The actual cost of being ready for the next pandemic is not gigantic. If you look at the precautionary measures where we spend on our defense budget, this won't be more than about 1% of that. Even our overall health research budget, the overall cost of what the U.S. needs to do will be about 10% of that. Climate, on the other hand, the numbers are quite large. If we can create markets and competitive products, it brings that cost down. But the scale of it, all of those industrial factories and the way we do transport and food, it's very tough. And if we go back to 2015, the R&D budgets had not gone up. The venture capital was largely turning away from green things because it realized it's a lot harder than, say, doing a website or software. And so the energy around innovation just wasn't there. That's gotten a lot better recently. The government R&D is going up in this space, including funding new generation of approaches in areas like storage or nuclear. Now, a lot of risk capital, partly because people are dying to get returns. They're willing to bet on even risky technology innovations because they see there'll be demand for the green products. So we made good progress on climate in the last few years. If it wasn't such a gigantic problem, you could say, okay, another decade of great work and we'll be there. Sadly, with this one, because of just the scale, every year between now and 2050, we're going to have the same prioritization and effort that we have. And that's partly why building a consensus around the problem, and even if we disagree about some tactics, that it is a huge priority, that we shouldn't drop it in some of those years, depending on what the political situation is. So I'm excited to see what the field is doing, but we're not one vaccine away from solving climate.
No, fortunately, right? That would be that's a sci-fi movie that we haven't seen yet, I think, that we might like to see or like to experience. Going back for a second to the pandemic, one of the things people are talking about is, as at least in the United States, we return to some form of normalcy, if slowly, is okay, well, what has changed and what has changed permanently? So what change came faster because of the pandemic? What changed in terms of, you mentioned, broadband and internet connectivity and the need for that. So what needs have been highlighted? What has changed? What do you think stays changed? And, we have a whole generation of people who are coming of age at a time of a great health and economic crisis combined. And so I'm curious how you're thinking about what could be lasting impacts from this pandemic.
Well, certainly the willingness to do things digitally was forced upon us. And so even the older generation that did very online shopping, had to get used to that as a way of buying. In the past, if a salesperson was going to come and, say they were interested in having you as a customer, their physical presence was kind of a necessary element of seriousness. If somebody had said, "Hey, I'll just show up on your screen," they would have said, "Yeah, well, the serious people are here in person." So as we go back and look at online learning versus in person, or doctors' meetings, for say therapy versus in person versus digital, I think we've realized that some part of the activity can be done on a virtual basis. And trying to decide as an employer, hey, do my employees have to be here 2 days a week, 1 week out of 4? If they live far away, are we willing to accommodate that? What's the minimum requirement? I hope people are going to their employee groups and thinking about, okay, there were some benefits to not having that long commute. There were some benefits to be able to hire people who live in different locations, and the cost of real estate, in the cities that are doing well, that became a barrier, particularly for the middle class jobs. And so, I wrote a book 25 years ago that said digital would make the importance of city centers less important. Certainly up until the pandemic, I was more than wrong. It was the opposite of the truth. A few city centers really thrived at the expense of other locations. And so we're in a very interesting period to take those lessons and, elimination of paperwork and lots of travel, and say, okay, what should the new steady state be? Almost every call I have, people say, hey, I look forward to seeing you in person. But, actually, some of those meetings I don't think need to be done in person. I'm working more with leaders in Africa. We do lots of 20 or 30-minute meetings instead of every couple of years flying in and, because you've gone so far, meeting longer than the true content about improving their health system really would justify. And now, doing it digitally multiple times a year, we only need to talk when there's an issue or, to reinforce some good thing that they're doing. So at least in that example, it's dramatically better than what came before.
It's interesting, right? When we all talk about how we're intentional, does this give us an opportunity to be more intentional with our time, to do more of the A work, the core example you just gave? I think the thing I'm worried we'll lose is serendipity. Do my grandchildren ever have a snow day? Is everything, since you can always be virtual, does it just get harder to turn off if things don't have to be live? So I just want you to know I'm starting a one-woman campaign to preserve the snow day, or something like it. So you just talked about a prediction you made about city centers. You also predicted in 2015 the risk of a global pandemic, and it makes this audience certainly want to hear from you about what you think the risks are that are out there still.
Well, the pandemic risk will always be there. It's actually pretty hard to say what it is per year. And there's two categories. There's natural pandemics, like we're quite sure this one was, and then there's intentionally caused pandemics. And so as we invest, we have to look at both of those scenarios, which, if you're not ready for, the toll can be very horrific. I mean, the death rate doesn't have to be well under 1%. It can actually be with something like the smallpox higher. So not to be super negative, that is a risk area that in some ways this wake-up call will be good for us going into the future. Climate and the great inequity in health around the world, are others that are big for me. The future of Africa in all of these things looms large because that's where you have most of the population growth, and yet it's also where you have the weakest governance and where climate, if we're not careful, will create massive migration. So, I think it's great people are going to pay more attention to the future of Africa and kind of focus our aid on what seems to work there, including, digital innovations like digital currency to let everybody have a bank account or to track money flows to reduce corruption. I feel like we're all talking about polarization and how we pull together to make our health systems and education systems better. I hope other people have good ideas on that. In the health and climate area, I really do see the innovators, and I can share that I'm optimistic about those things. On coming together politically, I'm hoping there's young people who figure out how we create a sense of collaboration that sometimes feels pretty weak over the last few years.
Well, I like your optimistic note, and I should let you in there. But I think that idea of science will win, and innovation and technology help, and the private sector will lead the way. I think those are all important themes. So we appreciate both you personally working on some of the toughest challenges and biggest risks that are out there, and you sharing your wisdom with us today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great to talk to you.
What a terrific way to end a two-day conference on global economic recovery. I want to thank Suzanne Clark and Bill Gates for a really interesting, informative conversation, talking about the need for leadership from the private sector, the need for market innovation, and all the other issues that they discussed. It really summed up the conference well. I just want to thank our global audience for joining the Chamber's Global Forum for Economic Recovery. We heard from some incredible speakers over these past 2 days, the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, heads of state and government, including President Duque of Colombia and President Kenyatta of Kenya, and of course, Prime Minister Lee of Singapore. And then there was the participation of so many executives from leading US and global companies. I think regardless of the topic, pandemic response, economic recovery, digital, climate change, energy, sustainability, US-China relationship, we heard essentially the same messages. America leadership is indispensable at this time. Partnership is also critical. The United States working with our allies, frankly, working with governments around the world to deal with the pressing challenges. But none of this can be done without the public-private partnership, which is why the business community is so important in any area, whether we're talking about healthcare, of course, climate, or any other issue. I want to thank our sponsors, Amazon, Google, and UPS, not just for the support of the forum, although we do thank you for that, but also for their efforts throughout the pandemic to provide critical goods and services to keep us all connected. And let me just say a special thanks to Suzanne Clark, our President and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She's such a tireless and forceful advocate for the power of business in driving economic recovery in the United States and globally. There were many, many compelling messages over the 2 days, but let me just focus on what Julie Sweet, the CEO of Accenture, said in discussing the pandemic response. She mentioned the need for connection, the need for strong commitment, and encourage collective action. I think her 3 C's are relevant to all the issues we discussed during this forum over the past 2 days. And the Chamber looks forward to working with you in helping business play such a vital role in the recovery of our global economy. We cannot do it just by working on the United States or Europe. We have to work together as a global community. I want to thank you all for participating. Stay healthy, stay hopeful that together we can make a difference, and I'm sure we will. And stay in touch with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much for participating in our two-day forum.